No, but you're gonna switch to for that's not. I didn't think that was so. Okay. Yeah, doesn't look like, label. That's fine.
Yeah, there's someone.
Exactly, we're very well learned. Great. I'm sure if you guys need anything, you're able to find space and pay, LCT,
Yeah.
some of they use stuff.
No, we have like a bunch now.
I just like.
Yeah.
Was there someone here for you?
There was, I have 12:50, I think I got one.
Part of it.
But I didn't hear like.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess with the cops. I guess we're all.
Okay, so, like, this life to be. Great, people in public safety. Right. So like, yeah. Yeah. Hey, all that. I don't really want to be involved with yeah. And then sometimes like easy and they're like, I was like, I have to play like 2 weeks. But I think myself and that's just someone who more about shop
And there's the past, and that's really before.
some those like I
Sorry, I'm a less of a sector, sorry. It is a trail. Right.
yeah, it's like we were at this meeting here and nothing will get right. It's like usually not going on track. Yeah. Yes, I think so. Yeah. And honestly.
Hey, look at this.
Yeah. I'm probably yeah.
That's my first. Did you like come on? Obviously, oh, I see. Yeah, that's horrible. I really bad. Like 5, 6.
That sounds nice. That's suspect.
Oh, yeah, I can move it. I'm through, yeah. Yeah, I know, sure.
Yeah.
I agree.
I finally have, I think, hours and I do different books. But it's more than I. Great, but like, you're big.
Our last semester of college, and really borrowed these pencil money, and I printed out my head all over. Sure.
Well, that's the difference.
I was reading straight, and I was like, okay, you, since pages 200, 150. Use 40.
Also, there's.
Getting a balance is pretty more fun. What do you think? Yes.
I work for one of them. I live in there.
Hi, sorry, I just have to get the. Sorry for the delay.
I was at the library.
Yeah.
It's that.
There is like.
It's not actually.
No, but it's.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I did. So my slides.
Yes.
That's a conversation.
Okay, we're looking at grammar if you want, we'll get started in about 5 minutes. There we go, I'm trying to with the diagram. Okay.
I also don't like it's like so close, like I don't want to buy it. I said it's enough for. Oh, yeah. I don't mean it. That's why
I just.
but that's why we like. But I'm gonna be gone. No, it's just a lie to say.
Do you want me to let, can you hear me?
Yeah.
But I background.
I was thinking of yeah, I'm just gonna say like. Yeah, I didn't know that.
So. I'll go back and listen.
Hey everyone, we're gonna get started. You can feel free to keep on grabbing food, but I'll just give a little introduction.
So this event is sponsored by Halakhic Left, which is a grassroots movement of halakhically observant Jews, advocating for our communities to oppose Jewish supremacy, support ending the Israeli military control and occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and work for a just and equitable future for the Jews and Palestinians. If you want more information on what we do, you can pick up one of our flyers, which is back there. You can also find the source sheets back there, as well as the sign-up sheet for our email list, where we send out a weekly newsletter with deep Torah, upcoming events. And there's going to be a collection of deep Torah for Pesach coming out next week. I believe there's still time to sign up for a printed copy, but I'm not 100% sure. This is our first event in a series called Jewish Reckoning with Power, a Halakhic Left learning series. There's going to be events in New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, DC. We're the first though. And each event is going to be live streamed and recorded and posted publicly. You know, the video recording won't have anyone in the audience, but you know, any audience questions, of course, will be part of the recording. So that people in other cities can watch. A lot of our recent Torah writing and teaching has engaged directly with the urgent reality of Israel-Palestine, but in this program, we're stepping back a little towards a broader and more abstract question that underlies these conversations of how does Jewish tradition understand, justify, resist, and reckon with power. Each day of learning will feature shiurim from multiple teachers, exploring different dimensions of Jewish engagement with power, textual, Halakhic, historical, and ethical. While the sessions will not all address the same sources or case studies, together they aim to open a shared conversation and provide conceptual tools that can deepen our Torah learning and inform contemporary Jewish moral and political thinking. Also, before we begin, a quick note that speaking doesn't imply an endorsement of Halakhic Left's political positions and principles, and what speakers say are their own personal views, not necessarily those of Halakhic Left, but we believe in learning Torah from a broad array of perspectives, and we're looking forward to hearing from the wonderful teachers. I don't have a personal relationship with every teacher, but I definitely, learned Torah from them indirectly, either directly or indirectly at various points, and I'm really say for all of them. So our first speaker is going to be Rabbi Aryeh Klapper. He is the Dean of the Center for Modern Torah Leadership and Rosh Beit Midrash with the Summer Beit Midrash, entering his 31st year of developing male and female Torah leaders. He's an internationally consulted Halakhic authority and thought leader. Rabbi Klapper is author of Divine Well and Human Experience, Explorations of the Halakhic System and its Values, and publishes a weekly Torah essay. We're very excited to see.
Thank you very much. Those of you who don't know who are not from Maine or who just with us during or after the share playing. We just saying yes, it's it. No idea it works. Okay. I'll try to record it first. Okay. So the question of civil disobedience is not a purely academic one for me. It's a question that I get asked every couple of years by a student, often by students whose political evaluations I disagree with. So the purpose of this share is not to express an evaluation of a particular circumstance, but to try and open the framework for a conversation about what would and would not justify civil disobedience. I'm going to spend the bulk of the share trying to do a negative in a sense, which is to try and talk about the bad reasons to object to civil disobedience. We're going to notice is that both the halakha is under theorized, and the other side of it is often, although it has been, I think, very well theorized philosophically, it's often not part of the conversation well enough. Right, so I'll try and mention those sides. So the way I would thought, sort of as a way of making it establishing bona fides, if nothing else, So I run a program called the Start Baby Trash that some of you attended. And in 2020, I actually framed a question around exactly this. Because I wanted to get a deeper understanding of what the framework was going to use could be. And even though it was 2020 was already about integration question. And I wanted to see what I this together would come up with if we addressed that question. And what I wanted to do was to challenge the edges of it as opposed to a direct question where it's easy, where you know right, where you know what's right and what's wrong, where you're just trying to figure out frameworks of how seriously to really challenge the question of what generates obligations to obey the law in the first place. And then when you have thought about what generates obligation to obey the law in the first place, and what right, then you can talk about under what circumstances, for what reasons, and in what ways might it be entitled to break the law. So the way I framed the question was dealing with somebody who discovers that they're in the United States illegally. So they discover they're in the United States illegally. So if you have a really narrow, right, a really straightforward framing in which you say that Halakhic incorporates secular law, and all the mandates of secular law become Halakhic because of right, you have some kind of thesis usually associated, we'll see with the term the law aligns the law. So then that should generate an obligation of self-deportation. It should certainly be illegal to acquire false IDs. Right, that was so it was really frame the question around yourself as opposed to the heroic saving somebody else model, which is often easier. It's often easily justified saving doing things that are formally illegal to save somebody else than for yourself, if you feel correctly and self-interested, as opposed to feeling heroic. So that was the question. The question was framed around that, and I tried to set up what where my subjectively I came from on this and the voice of the student. So one of the things I came from is that my mother's father-in-law, Shalom, always overpaid his taxes. He was a German Holocaust survivor. Came to the U.S. after World War II, and just had enormous gratitude to the United States. And the notion that under ordinary circumstances you could disobey the law, I think would have been horrifying. I think that's just a straightforward thing. You start off with enormous gratitude to the United States, and I think that's a highly reasonable position for Jews to take.
You want to
What we have had in this country, however long you want to go back toward Washington. How do I come to the church synagogue if I had a church Washington? Or you can, or you can talk about the golden era of the last 100 years or so. I think that's true. Yeah. Right, and if you take that, I think it really seriously. So then, and you adopt this notion that that Halakhic incorporates secular law. So you get a test which always came up for me, which was speeding. Are you allowed to speed? Because speeding is technically a violation of the law. And at one point, probably before I had a license, I was pretty strongly in the position that you shouldn't speed. Also, before I got my first speeding ticket, when I wasn't speeding, which made me feel much more cynical about the enforcement of the law. They plainly anti-Semitic. You think I know you, but no, plainly anti-Semitic. Going the same as everybody else. Upstate New York and the time in upstate New York did not have a reputation for being hospitable. But that was, and that sort of, so that was one sort of test. Like, I really believe that that Halakhic incorporates secular law. Now there are ways to resolve it, right? The ways to resolve it by saying things like it incorporates secular law, but only secular law the government actually wants to enforce. And then speeding becomes a really interesting test. You think that's a law that the government wants to enforce, but it's really dangerous to leave that subjective. People decide which laws the government really wants to enforce, which laws the government doesn't want to enforce. The one extreme version we did that summer. There is a diet on the Israeli Supreme Court who argues that does not apply to the Haredi sector in Israel, particularly for labor laws in the Haredi sector in Israel, because the government has never made any effort to enforce them, and therefore they clearly the government doesn't intend to. And therefore, minimum wage, all sorts of things like that don't apply to the early educational sector in Israel. So, right, that's it. There's always a dangerous argument people want to claim that the government doesn't really want to enforce this law. There is a counter this way to it, right? Right, where courts in the US also want to enforce certain kinds of law, but a dangerous idea. Okay. For example, another example is some place, but and that had to be opposed to right, to any notion of incorporating civil law into halakha. And as I got older, specifically, Rabbi Saul Berman, who I know might be a controversial quote in this today in this setting, but who is as a teacher, friend, and hero. And I think that one should appreciate the courage. And I also think that the report was radically overstated as to how negative. I've heard worse reactions to my joke at conferences, where it should also not be booed. For equally courageous statements that went against the spirit of the crowd. So Rabbi Berman's stories of the spending Purim in Selma, those are things that were always heroic to me. So it was always inconceivable to me that there would be no space for civil. The disobedience of the civil rights movement. I was very proud that Lori Picker-Nice was part of the group providing a white Virgin shield for protesters in Ferguson. She was actually arrested and I brought her to talk to my program about that. So Marat graduate was also a graduate along my program. And so I always assumed that was correct. Okay, so the question is, how do we deal with this balance? On the one hand, and it's not a hard balance in the sense that probably all of you, even if you don't have a religious or Halakhic basis, you probably start off with that framework. On the one hand, there's a basic idea that you're supposed to be law-abiding, and on the other hand, that there are circumstances, right, that we have in American history of all sorts of moments where we think of civil disobedience as virtuous. Okay, so I think the first level solution is, and here I'm starting the response that I wrote to the question, is that first of all, you study biblically. Obviously, you know you're not supposed to always obey the secular law because we have heroic actions in Tanakh, right, that are contrary to civil law. Midwives, right, Daniel, everyone understands that there's going to be a boundary. Right, idolatry is certainly a boundary violation, right? The state forcing you to violate Shabbat. Right? But anytime the state directly and deliberately puts its force against your religious obligations, I think we all intuitively understand that can't work. Right? That you have to disobey the state. But I think that as United States citizens, up till now, it's been kind of hard to imagine the state mandating that kind of behavior. Although I grew up in an environment where school prayer was unconstitutional. And my mother correctly pointed out to me that never having experienced school prayer, my position that might not be so terrible if we allowed it again is very naive. My mother grew up in Switzerland, being forced to recite anti-Semitic poems in literature class, and so she had a much stronger position. And you can imagine, right, that there are all sorts of places where if you think that certain Christian statements are idolatry, it would be perfectly reasonable to imagine a circumstance where the government compels you to articulate idolatrous statements in practice. If you think that Christianity and specific forms of Christianity, which to a certain extent differentiate, I think you have to. Otherwise, you sort of. I don't think we can make a claim that people who martyred themselves rather than make certain Christian statements did so unnecessarily. I think that's untrue to Jewish history. So it's right. So you have to a certain extent, even though my own Halakhic position is that Christian theology is not idolatrous, I think you have to allow for some way for certain aspects of Christianity, certainly to define it as Zara if you want to be true to human history. Okay. So what I think is that the way in which the reason that we obey the law the rest of the time under-theorized, and that puts us in trouble when we try and think about places where it's not a clear Halakhic mandate against a right which the state is obviously telling us to do. It's more that the law does something which violates our general sense of what halakha or Torah requires. It seems unethical to us, but there are people who might agree with us in principle about ethics and disagree about the application. Right? That's where the rubber hits the road. I think that's a really hard question. Like what happens if there is an ethical rationale for what the government wants you to do, but you think that's wrong? How wrong do you have to think it to be? How obviously wrong do you have to think it to be? How serious a violation does it have to be? Is it really a difference between ethics and law in that way that if somebody actually turn that into law, all of a sudden, then the government can't tell you to violate the law. But if it's just left vague, maybe because it was too obvious, right? Always like claim when people don't say something, it could be because they don't think it's true, or it could be because they think it's too obvious to say. Right? So certain things, you say, look, this obviously violates a command to love the stranger, right? So nobody has to write. Right? Nobody has to write that down, or no, right? Loving a stranger has done, right? Loving a stranger doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of right territoriality or right limit immigration or things like that. I was just reading it too. I'm trying to remember where I was reading it, where the government insisted that the Jews provide. Reading Moshe Rosman's founder of Hasidism. We talked about how the town of Medved was given a mandate, an order by the government that they had to give a list of which Jews were illegals, and they did. They gave a list of Jews to be deported from Medved and Colombia. So certainly, like the claim that that you have a universal notion that you can't, the immigration boundaries are always illegal and people right. That's not true to Jewish history or Halachic history either. So trying to figure out how, right now you might decide that was a bad precedent. They can always do that, right? But deny that there's such a precedent, claim that the history of halakha has always been about including all immigrants. No, Gemara has really good, really interesting discussions about economic obligations to refugees and how economic obligations to refugees relate to the economic rights of the residents. And they set boundaries, right? Refugees have to be supported, but they don't have to be given economic circumstances which create permanent competition, which does the market, all sorts of things like that. And one of the things that we always have to think about is the extent to which our visions of economic justice are framed by living in an incredibly wealthy country, where we don't imagine that the cost of redistribution is poverty. But for people who thought, but for much of Jewish history, world history, the cost of redistribution is poverty. A few people get out of it, and everyone else lives in it, and you can redistribute, and everyone lives in poverty. And think about whether that is necessarily what Halakhic justice demands. And even if you think it doesn't, you might think that in an environment where we in fact are incredibly wealthy, and the cost of redistribution is not poverty, that the world changes. That's also a perfectly reasonable position to say that the obligations are entirely different in that, let's say that the United States is required to have open borders, but it would be silly to, for Darfur to have the same rule. That's also an entirely reasonable position. Okay. I threw in because I think in a shiurim on civil disobedience you always have to quote Torah. I actually was not very influenced by Torah, more influenced by letter from Birmingham jail and that kind of stuff. My daughter really hated Torah when she reported her elementary school, that also has influenced on me. But Torah is important in this regard. Because when he says, I'll read the whole quote, it is a cool quote, right? The massive men serve the state thus, it's all the issue. Not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army and the militia, jailers, constables, pasikotas, etc. In most cases, there's no free exercise whatever the judgment or the moral sense. That they put themselves on a level with wood and earth and stones, and wooden men can perhaps be manufactured that will serve the purpose as well. Such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt. They have the same sort of worth only as horses and dogs. Yet such as these even are commonly esteemed good citizens. Others, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads. As they rarely make any moral distinctions, they are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. very few, as heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers in the great sense, and men serve the state of their consciences also, and so necessarily resist it for the most part. And they are commonly treated as enemies by it. Okay, this is a glorious statement of civil disobedience, but which attempts to bridge the gap we're dealing with by claiming that the way in which you actually serve the state is through disobedience, and Thoreau is talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act is a good extreme case, where on the one hand, you can hopefully come to the conclusion that the Fugitive Slave Act is deeply immoral against an explicit pasuk in the Torah, and also the failure to enforce it leads to civil war. And it's a really interesting cost-benefit framework. That's what Thoreau is talking about. But the problem is that most civil disobedience does not have anywhere near that. Thoreau is explicit that he thinks that it would be better to overthrow a state that enforces the Fugitive Slave Act than to obey it. But most civil disobedience is not in a circumstance where you reach the conclusion that strongly. That it would be better to not have a state than to have a state that would enforce that law. What we want is to have a state which doesn't enforce that law. Right? That's a very different, right? That's Thoreau's radical justification doesn't really work for most cases. And then, within civil disobedience, there are at least three kinds short of Thoreau's, which is, I'll do this as long as either it is not possible to engage in a successful revolt, or as long as I don't, or if I believe this would work instead of a successful revolt. But Thoreau's connected essays are all about John Brown, right? Valorizing John Brown, and the Rainer Harper Surrey, and Bloody Kansas, and all sorts of things. So he doesn't see nonviolence as an essential component of civil disobedience, or what he's talking about. And so it's careful not to conflate what Thoreau is talking about with Martin Luther King or Gandhi or any others. And there's a second kind of civil disobedience, which is what King and to some extent Gandhi are famous for, which is civil disobedience which validates the right of the state to punish and accepts it. Right? Where the goal is to dare the state to arrest it. And that is an attempt to claim, as against Thoreau, that the purpose of my activities is not in any way to undermine the state. My purpose is to strengthen the state both morally and practically, because I'm showing that I'm willing to accept the consequences of disobedience. And that works if you have a state which is subject to conscience. If you believe that the people of your state are subject to conscience on this, right? That is the success of Gandhi in a sense, if you're not cynical, that the British actually had a conscience. And that is the success of the civil rights movement, if you actually believe that, although you can have a much more cynical framework. What you're doing is inspiring some people to be willing to impose their power on others, as opposed to getting specific people to change their mind. Right? That's a fair framing. Then there's a third kind of civil disobedience, which is resistance to a particular law, which you might abandon if you got to the point of revolution, but you're not validating the state's right to punish for that law. You might, you might just try to impede the state that's enforcement of the law without breaking the law yourself. And therefore, the state has no right to object to what you're doing because you're not breaking any laws. You're just impeding the capacity of the authorities to enforce the law on others, right? That is, in large measure, what seems to have been intended in Minnesota. Right, so those lose the moral force of saying that your goal is to reinforce the authority of the state. And therefore, there might be certain theories of the in which that is not okay, where even though the civil rights movements form the civil disobedience, and they might, because they have less of that immediate argument behind it. Okay. So with that, recognizing that there are all these forms of civil disobedience, let's go back to see. It's your phone. My phone. Okay. Let's go back and see to some extent what there is. So usually people cite the phrase "din malchut din," Dina Malchudina shows up in 4 places in the Talmud. I'm trusting my student Leah Weinstein's summary of the sources in this regard. And the 4 cases, right, the Darn 28a is talking about the right to collect taxes and the prohibition against lying to legitimate tax collectors. You can lie to illegitimate tax collectors, and then whole literature, what constitutes a legitimate as opposed to an illegitimate tax collector. Right, that's one kind of debate. Right, so one of the frameworks is if they don't actually fix the amount, right? So they just giving all your money as taxes, right? That doesn't work. But it deals with challenging cases because there are often taxes were not directly collected by the government, but the right to collect taxes was sold. So it's really hard to distinguish what a legitimate tax collector was from an illegitimate tax collector, aside from dealing with who's legitimate authority, right? If a brigand sets up as literally as a highway toll person, right? Is that a legitimate tax or an illegitimate tax? But okay, there's a concept of legitimate taxation, which it is even though it legitimates the taxation and forbids lying to escape that taxation. And the second point, I think, Barakama 119b, which says no, actually, it depends on the tax collector is part of a community or not. The tax collector from outside a community can be presumed to be corrupt. That still deals with the same issue. Legitimate, non-corrupt taxation is legitimate, and you can have your own position about the errors under whichever president. Right, and you can debate, we talk about whether it's the institution or the specific collector, right, whether you have avenues of appeal, all those are basic, they all deal with taxation. Of Basra 54b quotes from Klapper about whether the government has the right to regulate real estate sales in certain ways. And Gittin 10b validates certain government documents. Certain government documents are acceptable in Halakhic courts of law, even though they don't meet the Halakhic standards for witnesses. Okay, none of that gets you speeding. Right? And that doesn't get you the vast majority of law. So I think a fair argument is that Dina is fundamentally about property rights, not about law at all. And Professor Chaim Semen has argued, I think he's right, that fundamentally Dina is less about your obligations than a defense of government agents, the legality of government agents' actions. Because by what right do I take your property as a tax collector? So we have legitimate taxation so that you, the Jewish tax collector, is not a thief. But you're not a thief doesn't impose any kind of obligation on me to give you the money. Even if I can't lie to you, that doesn't mean I have to give you the money. Right? I don't have to be my grandfather and overpay. Right? Maybe I can't lie on my tax returns, but I don't. Right? But do I have to? Do I have to report all cash things? I don't. Right? All sorts of ways you could get out of here without any kind of general notion of an emotional law. And even within the realm of property, Dina can be significantly limited. For example, Dina could mean that within the rule of law, on page 3, all property within the territory of a sovereign is held with the sovereign's will, and can be transferred whatever and by whatever means the sovereign sees fit. Okay, so the only limitation on the government's right to take your property is what we call due process. And due process can be defined in every system. But as long as you have a form of law, the government can do whatever it wants, because really all property belongs to the government, to the sovereign. Right? We shouldn't say the government, we should say the sovereign, because it's a much more complicated system than the government. We'll get to that later. Second possibility is that that's not true. Actually, even within the realm of property, the government is limited in certain kinds of regulations. It can't take property arbitrarily. It can't take property from some people and not others. And possibly you can't have a progressive income tax. Right, that's the most fun one. Rabbi J.D. Black, my teacher, is very fond of arguing that the progressive income tax is justified, which is based on a couple of interesting moves. But fundamentally, the argument goes like this: that Dina Malchudina was rationalized as allowing sovereigns to engage in the practices which were recognized as legitimate for sovereigns at the time the Torah was given. So I like arguing that if you can't find a progressive income tax in any government prior to Matan Torah, then you can't legitimate now. It's a great argument. They always tell you that I shouldn't say this publicly because he's a law professor. But okay, if you happen to take that position, which it gets a laugh now, but if you read any kind of classical political philosophy, you understand they have nothing to restrain government other than custom. So they have to make the custom, right, the custom limitation of the government law. And that's all that's doing it, right? We live in a society where we have a successful model of humanly created law, right? Humanly created law, which is not created, in a Burkean sense of slow accretion over time. Right? But if you're Burke and all you're looking, right, and you think that allowing human beings to make up laws leads to the French Revolution, then you're not right. You're not going to allow anything new. Right? Anything new is dangerous. Right? You'll tell me, but some new things are necessary. Yeah, well, those new things are necessary. You're going to claim that there was a precedent. And you'll see if people are convinced or not. Okay. So what are the sources they get? There are two sources that are usually quoted. The first one is Rabbi Nissim the Ran, and here's what he's read, who is quoting the Tosafist, but his formulation is usually quoted rather than any specific Tosafist formulation. We could happily spend a semester just going through the different formulations that's found in different medieval sources, but this is the one that gets quoted. Here we go. The Chassuda Tosafist, they read the Tosafist. The Davka b'malchei of Kokarim Amar Yedina Malchutadina. So he claims that it's only, the term Dina Malchutadina only applies to Gentile or idolatrous kings. And it doesn't apply to Jews, and this is part of the whole controversy about the legitimacy of law in the state of Israel, which is Halakhic. All right, how seriously you take that line, we'll talk about that. If they sha'aretz shalom, because the land belongs to the Melech. V'yachol amar lehem, and so we can say to any member of the population or any resident, Im lo ta'asu mitzvotai agaresh etchem min haaretz. I have the right to banish you if you disobey. Right. So therefore, the right of the sovereign comes from a claim that the sovereign has the right to banish you. But that's not true about kings of the Jews, Jewish kings. Lefish Eretz Yisrael in Israel. Lefish Eretz Yisrael kol Yisrael shutafin ba. Right. As the main right in Eretz Yisrael, a Jewish king, all the Jews have a share in the land. Right, that's the end of Sefer Vayikra, right? It's all ancestral land. All debates, right? Third day to make that converts too, right? All sorts of debates, women right now, all these conversations. But the theoretical framework is that whatever is defined as a citizenry has an equal right to the land. There is no sovereign who has the right to expel. And without a sovereign right to expel, there's no right to impose laws that aren't universal, that aren't imposed either democratically or theocratically. Either God gives the laws and we all accept them in Sinai, or we make up the laws ourselves, but there's no such thing as a sovereign with the obligation to impose law for a Jewish king in Israel. So if you look at this drawing, you'll see, first of all, hang on a second, it doesn't actually relate to Dina Malchusa Dina as a framing at all, it really has nothing to do with property rights. And secondly, it also says nothing about right. It just says power. So in that sense, it's really unsatisfying. It doesn't actually provide any kind of theoretical basis for Dina Malchusa at all. And obviously there are limits to the king. He can't tell you to worship idols. You should leave. Okay, what happens if the king says anybody who speeds is not allowed to live here and you speed? You have to self-deport? No, he has a right. If he deports you, right, so then you don't have a right to object and say he's doing something terrible. On the other hand, what do we do, right? What do we do if we take the Ran's theory and say that we don't accept his notion of the sovereign? That's not how we function. We consider, whether, let's say specifically in the United States, right, where the people are explicitly the sovereign. Right, we can talk about England, right? But the United States, the people are still the United States should function, like Israel. Right, biblical Israel, imagine biblical Israel, where there's no sovereign that has the right to expel any individual. And we can talk about, right, that whether that talks about immigration specifically. But so the Ran is usually cited to talk about this notion that power makes right, but the power makes right argument is really not related to the Gemara at all. And the more interesting thing he does is he sets up his notion that Dina Malchusa only functions in a system which has a sovereign that pre-exists the people. But in an environment where the people are the sovereign, he owns the theory. He doesn't have anything. Okay, the second thing that people say is the Rashbam, that's on page 5. Rashbam says the following: Kol misim v'anuniyot mitagos kol mishpatem lachim sheregilim lanhik b'malchutam. Right, all the taxes and various kind of lists of taxes and practices. I mean, minagod is a vague term. I don't know what that means. Shel mishpatei hamlachim. So there's a term that has that that is a kind of a life type limit. It has to be within the bounds of normal royal practice. No one can. Right? Sheregilim lanhik malchutam, which is the kind of thing that kings do and everything. Dinah, they're all law. Why? Because all the members of the kingdom, the Bnei HaMalchut, accept this upon themselves willingly. Accept the rules of the king upon themselves willingly. Okay, so I think it's so some people want to argue that that's because Rashbam obviously is anticipating no taxation without representation, and right, it really has this very dramatic theory. It seems highly implausible, particularly if you see him as explaining Dina Malchut Dina, because he knows that Dina Malchut Dina was not as used by the Amor Samuel. It's always the Amor Samuel talking about the Sasanian Empire. Is not dealing with democratic government, so it's absurd to claim that's what he means. What he is dealing with, right, is essentially is offering a Hobbesian perspective, which is that consent is always a construct. And they tell you, right, even in the United States, consent of the government is a construct because the people who consented are 200 years ago, or 50 years ago. And everybody has tried to struggle, everybody in democratic theory has struggled for years and years to try and figure out how that consent binds us. And this is not a modern problem, but it has a specific issue in democracy, but any theory which is built on consent has to struggle to figure out why that consent continues. In Jewish tradition, the way that this comes up with is a fascinating conversation about why the Torah is binding on us, just because our ancestors accepted it as Sinai. And if you take the position that the Torah is binding only because we accepted it, which is a normative position, then there has to be a way for that consent to continue. Why? How? There are a lot of really bad answers to that. A lot of really, really bad answers to that. As there were lots of really bad answers to the question of how authority is sustained. But it would be a mistake to think of Rashbam as offering what we would call a democratic position is much more compatible with Hobbes. There is a presumption that everybody agrees to the government having power over everything, including life and death, because the alternative is life is nasty, British, and short. Right, and then we can talk about how, given that the government, right, that the Leviathan begins with all authority, we can talk about how to restrict that. Right, under what ways whether the beginning is absolute power, or you can decide that maybe Rashbam must be more radically anticipated lock in some way. Right, but either way, no matter what, you're working with some kind of social contract theory. And the question is, to what extent social contracts well. And the thing again here is that this is not really a good explanation for the Talmud's Dina Malchut Dina, because there's no reasonable limit to property. And so what actually we have is, if you want to go through the tradition, is you have a term Dina Malchut Dina. The term Dina Malchut Dina doesn't help you at all. You have a concept where people have over-explained that idea. Right? The theories that people offer for that idea explain too much. But they weren't really interested in having them explain more, because they lived under evil governments, mostly. And right, and they're not right, and this is sort of the equivalent of somebody trying to justify Dina Malchut Dina, modern world talking about, in the Soviet Union. Right, you're an Orthodox rabbi in the Soviet Union trying to explain Dina Malchut Dina while the government is persecuting you, trying to wipe out your identity. Everyone in the government is corrupt. What would Dina Malchut Dina mean? So you have to write all. But later on, you need to accept money as some kind of standard. You need to be able to engage in some kind of commerce. Maybe not in the Soviet Union, in a communist society, but even then, you probably did. Right. So the problem is different in a world where you expect a benevolent government to continue. And the truth is that we may be, we may have been naive about that, but we might really be one of the first Jewish communities in history that had been under the impression we had an enabling government that could continue. Now that depends on what your, if your vision of the United States is that it's really just as evil as every other empire in history. And after all, like, we kept slaves, right? So we had one of the worst, we had one of the worst oppressive things of all time. We just got a Jim Crow in the 60s. Right? So if you think the United States is just another instance of evil governments in which the elite perpetuates their powers and practically accept with extreme inequality, I don't know that you have anything other than utopian visions in Halakhic to help you. And I think like part of the notion of civil disobedience is fundamentally grounded in the notion that you have a basically good government, but you don't want to revolt against, right? That's where I think Thoreau is extreme in that regard, and we could go back to Thoreau and say more right and say, no, really, what we want is a revolution, but we can't have it. We would support John Brown. But if you're not going to support John Brown, right, then you have to recognize that civil disobedience is largely based on the premise that that the government is good, and then you have to figure out how good it goes. You can do it on a Rashbam basis, and you can do it on a Hobbesian basis and say that any government is better than no government. And that experience teaches that revolutions usually don't lead to better governments. So that's it, right? So it's a question of whether you're a messianist or not. If you're a messianist, you believe that that this revolution will be different, and a lot of that depends on whether you think the American Revolution was different. The American Revolution is the example of a revolution that has good results. Right? It's the counter to the French Revolution. If you think that the American Revolution didn't accomplish anything more than that, then what's your argument? So you can go back to, right? So that's where I talked about the we're on page 6. Right, so I gave you Chevrolet's from which I think is excellent. Right, throughout most of our history, Jews were considered second-class citizens wherever we lived. We lived mostly in semi-autonomous communities and dealt with the government as individuals only when necessary. We were taxed unfairly and otherwise treated differently. We were also mostly left to our own devices in our close and insular communities. Dina Malchut Dina was a concession. It was a halakha that required obedience to certain government rules, even when the government hated us, tried its best to keep us downtrodden, or perhaps even to destroy us. I didn't Malchut Dina in Megillah Esther. The United States, Jews are treated as equal citizens and are politically integrated in general society. We regard most laws that the American government makes as benefiting not only society in general, but also us as Jews in particular. And this is where you get a famous statement of Moshe Feinstein didn't quote, where people often quote the phrase "Malchut shel Chesed." That's a mistake. Moshe didn't make up that phrase. He's not actually the person who most commonly uses that phrase, and it doesn't mean anything at all. We should stop using that at all, but I hope I will write sometime soon, where Moshe says something much more radical after he says Malchut shel Chesed, which you can find about the Ottoman Empire, earlier, and then actually, which Menashe Klein uses, probably got from Moshe and uses also all over the place. Malchut shel Chesed doesn't assume any concept of obligation. Doesn't assume any, right? It's just like it's arbitrary. But Moshe says that we live in a government which has the interest of all of its citizens as its goal when it makes laws. That's a very radical statement. Right? The purpose of this government is to improve the lives of all its citizens. And that we could trace the whole history about how that plays out. That was a test for Dina Malchut Dina in certain sources. Is the law implemented with the intent to benefit the lives of the citizens, or is it only for the sake of the king? Right? That's where different theories of Dina Malchut Dina will begin to differ. So Chevrolet said, America is different. Now we start off, and we can say that there's a Mishnah Avot, right, which all of you know, right? You should pray for the peace of the government, because without the government, people would need to life. So I wrote a paper in college arguing that wasn't actually an endorsement of Hobbes, right? That there are many other ways in which you can understand without going straight to Hobbes and thinking the government has absolute power. But I think it's a good point to say that it's hard to read Jewish tradition without saying that Jewish tradition believes that you shouldn't walk into situations where law is unjust on the premise that utopia is coming. So work on the assumption that most systems of anarchy are worse than almost any form of government. right? It's what we call a failed state. Right? Failed states are worse places to live in than almost any government. So the question then is how you engage in the cost-benefit analysis. If you engage in civil disobedience in such a way that it is likely to limit the authority of the state. What costs are you willing to engage in? What happens? We're dealing right now with the interesting question of what to my mind, wholly legitimate, wholly legitimate effort to hold police accountable for illegal actions leads to failure to enforce the law, which has all sorts of social consequences everywhere. You have to think about that, right? It's wrong for the police to react that way, but that is great. But if you're a pragmatist, you say, okay, is what I'm doing likely to lead to an improvement in police practice, or is it likely to lead to police slowdowns, which will lead to rising crime rates, which will lead to a battle? And there isn't a premise in tradition that you always do the thing which appears to be the right thing in the moment, as opposed to engaging in a long-term calculation, which assumes that anarchy is probably the worst outcome ever. But you have to play odds, right? And there are always hopes that it's different, and if you're optimistic, you think the United States did turn out different, and it's still turning out different, maybe. Okay. So I think you have to take that as a given. On the other hand, you can find all sorts of limits, even on Dina Malchut Dina in tradition, where we ban discrimination. I have an article with several people who argue that equal protection is a fundamental principle of halakha, and that the law is illegitimate if it doesn't meet the standards of equal protection. If it treats any group or individual different, on the basis of their specific characteristics, as opposed to on the aim of an abstract law. And you can see the Ramah really talks about whether you have taxation that regulates usury as opposed to other professions, which isn't rationally justifiable. But you talk about whether you want strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, or what your constitutional standard to be. And then you can talk about, if you think the law is illegitimate, does that mean halakha thinks you're entitled to disobey? And under what circumstances? So what is your basis for obeying it? Right? If it's illegitimate under Dina Malchut Dina. So that's where we're going to. Right now, I think we have 5 minutes left, right? So let's try and bring us to the conclusion. The rationales classically offered for Dina Malchut Dina fail to explain Dina Malchut Dina and fail to provide real guidance for dealing with challenges. Right? That's the bottom line. Right? There isn't really, that language is not the right language for addressing the question. So there have been all sorts of attempts in the 20th and 21st century to come up with different groundings for Dina Malchut Dina. Rabbi Henkin, those of you who don't know him, was a really fascinating figure in the early 20th century, got overshadowed by Rabbi Feinstein later, but you should look at his tshuva. So he has a fascinating tshuva which he talks about how the ban on treating people differently, of course, doesn't apply to the rich and the poor. You're allowed to treat the poor better than the rich. Redistribution is a legitimate aim of government. Everyone understands that. Right, so I gave you that, right? That's a cool idea. Professor Weiss has talked about how Dina Malchut Dina is not grounded in any of these rationales. It's grounded fundamentally in the biblical obligation to create a law of dinim, right? Because I'll say that there's an obligation to create a functional system, and you want to create that functional system as best you can, right? And so it's not grounded in any kind of specific rationale. It's grounded in general obligation to be a good citizen. And then you can think of whatever theory you want for what constitutes good government and what citizen. Right? Halakha has very little to tell you about that. The really interesting thing that is implicit in Rabbi Weiss's argument, which is not elsewhere, is that it's really the first time where Jews are formally part of the polity, and so we are So our goal, we have obligations to establish a governmental system together with the non-Jewish population. Right, that's right. As we normally say, that's their obligation. Our obligation is halakha. Here, in democracy, which gives Jews full franchise, you have to think about, right? You have to think about, so what is our obligation regarding that? And that says all sorts of fascinating things about to what extent this private Jewish law about abortion or things like that should be part of civic law. When, for example, if you think that it's tolerable to have laws about abortion are different for Jews and non-Jews, which many people do, I don't, but many people do. Right, so then what do you think about it? What should the law be in a democratic society where Jews have a vote? Right, should it be the law for Jews, the law for non-Jews? It would be great to say, no, it should be different, the law should be different for Jews and non-Jews, but that violates equal protection probably, right? And that's not practical, you can't do that. That's a really interesting question. Our official chapter has argued that the right way to conceive of Jews in America is as engaged in a giant partnership. The United States is a corporation, and we're all partners, and we each have equal responsibility for the outcomes. So those are very different frameworks, right? Under none of those say that there is any kind of specific correspondence between American law and Holocaust. But when you're engaged in the question whether you have to obey any specific law, the answer is, well, I have an obligation to be a good citizen. Which is the way we like to frame it rhetorically. Now, what does it mean to be a good citizen? So Thoreau gives you one vision of what it's like to be a good citizen. But probably, and I wrote the introduction to a book on Judaism and libertarianism, so I have a lot of sympathy for libertarian positions, but they're winning in the US right now, so that's not terribly relevant to take a libertarian position relative to the government in the US when libertarianism has lost so badly. We have administrators say we have a social welfare state, we have all sorts of things like that. Whether you think that the liberty cost of that was worth it or not, I'm somewhat ambivalent about that. So what we need is a religious conception of what constitutes good citizenship and to what extent part of the obligation of good citizenship is to oppose laws with whatever means are necessary, try and appeal to the conscience of our neighbors, impede, actively disobey without accepting consequences. Right? That's a whole new theory. We don't have it right now. I think that there's always a chance that people, inevitably people will bring their own ideologies into the conversation about what constitutes that. I think, but much of the conversation only makes sense if you think the United States actually is a cool experiment, and not if you think the United States is just the continuation of the same old. But you don't have to agree with me about that. I think it has to take place in the shadow of constant awareness that the results of anarchy are traditionally considered to be worse than the results of even oppressive government. But also that it took place in a system where you didn't have responsibility or capacity to improve the government. We have that responsibility and capacity, but we also have the vote, right? So part of it depends whether you think the vote works. I think the vote works, so then it might be that disobedience is much harder to justify. If you think that the system is rigged, then obviously disobedience is much easier to justify. But again, I think that if you think the system is rigged, you're much more likely you should be much less optimistic about what will come. So my own preference is that the model that we should really work with most is the Martin Luther King model of civil disobedience, which accepts punishment, as opposed to disobeying the law just because we think we can nullify that law, as opposed and not have to talk like that. That would be my take. That is the most dignity. That's the easiest argument to construct as a good citizen. I don't have to say that I have never aspired to be arrested. I just a while back there was an occasion when some of my friends were really excited that they finally got to be arrested and got their 60s fantasies. I have been threatened with it several times, but it's not one of my aspirations. And so I can't tell you, that I have the power, that I have the courage to do it. I never have. And it might be that you think that we've hit a point in this country's history at this time where there's no conscience to appeal to. It's ultimately a depressing point, but that would also be a real possibility. Okay, I think it's my time. Thank you all for listening. And I put all my contact info and all that stuff at the end, so you're welcome to be in touch if you so wish.
Are you open to taking any questions?
I'm happy to take questions. As long as I just don't want to cut in everyone else's time.
Yeah, we can take 5 minutes for questions.
Yes. Well,
Thank you. Something that I would think that is, I think probably able to be accounted for within this framework that you haven't spoken to, is the kind of civil disobedience that's breaking a kind of non-morally objectionable law to make a point about another law. Right, like blocking a street, like, I don't think there's any particular moral good in blocking a street, but I've done it and I do it again for the sake of like slowing down these years of carceral state or making a point or like, and obviously there's calculations about how, if it's not effective, then like it's probably more problematic. But if you're convinced that it's effective,
So
that's
it's a
different
good-
than breaking a law that's fundamentally unjust on itself.
So I actually got that shout out.
Oh, yeah.
I actually got that shout out. Not here, but in Israel. And I think what I answered to that a little bit was that if you work on this premise that you don't ends up with citizenship, so then it's not one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
On the other hand, blocking streets has innocent victims.
Yeah.
Economic victims, the shopkeepers suffer, the people waiting for traffic suffer.
And many people who advocate that tactic say that that's not a,
Right.
that's a goal, rather.
So my sense is that takes harming specific individual others, right, requires much more justification than mere disobedience to the law. So I'm very nervous that kind of tactic is more self-satisfying than, and I wonder whether it's, whether when the goal is simply to attract publicity, all right, I think it's 100% clear that kind of, I think it's clear that kind of activity doesn't mean a universal liability test. Right? If everybody feels that they can stop traffic whenever they think something immoral happens, traffic never happens. And no specific thing gains. Right? It's just traffic's always stopped. Right? So I have deep trouble with that as a tactic, but that is that's a prudential. But it is a moral aspect. I think I'm very, very nervous about tactics which have innocent victims. And that tactic has lots of innocent victims. Yes?
Do you think there are any tactics that don't have any innocent victims?
Yeah, I don't think that having fugitive slaves had innocent victims.
I mean, like Selma blocked the streets. Yeah.
Pardon?
Like Selma blocked the streets from the cars.
So I guess you're blocking the streets to prevent the posse from chasing after them? Okay, right, there might be some economic, but this is not like blocking Wall Street, right, where, let's say, Hill Street Cafe dies. Right, if you want to recommend Hill Street Cafe in New York dies because it can never get any, because no one comes and you're opening your business. It has severe economic damage to people who have no interest in it at all. So that's my thing. I can't say it's never justified, but as a situation where that becomes the normal first thought tactic as opposed to, but my basic activist experience was running a series of demonstrations at YU with other people, and we did mass in front of the building. That was always a comic thing because it created newspaper articles about how we were blocking access to class, but actually the administration didn't want students piling up in front of class either, so they opened up a back door. We didn't want students walking through the picket line, so it turned out to be both of us had an interest in not actually blocking anybody who didn't want to be blocked. If we didn't want to be blocked, just went around the door. Happily, the press didn't go around the corner and had no idea how many students were supposed to be piled up in front of the building. So I never actually engaged in blocking something that actually had the consequence of not allowing someone to get to where they wanted to get.
It sounds like the publicity was useful in that circumstance.
Pardon?
The publicity was then useful.
Yeah, but we also didn't actually harm anybody, right? We would have, I think we would have let people through. I think we did let people through, even if they tried to walk through the picket line. I think that would have been right. I could be wrong about historically what we did. I think so. I do know the back door was open. We didn't take the back door. Yes.
When America had the whole prohibition in the, 20s or whatever,
Yeah.
so Jews generally did not use wine for Kiddush, or?
Actually, there was a sacramental exception. It became a big issue because obviously the mob would pressure rabbis to distribute the wine for them. This is actually the cause of grape shifts, right? The famous claim about this, that Professor Louis Ginsburg of JTS published a tshuva saying that grape juice was acceptable for Kiddush, and that made the front page of the New York Times. And that became it's a fascinating history. The other argument was that prohibition was actually a law that most of the government had no interest in enforcing. Right? So prohibition is interesting law that way. Yeah, both those are interesting, but there's a, there's several articles about grapefruit specifically, and how maybe Kevin was actually founded by that shit. And good for, I used to like grapefruits a lot more than I do now. Okay, last question. Aaron? Yeah.
Not kind of a side tangent, but you talked about why, like, we should why the Torah is still like mandatory for us to follow, even though we didn't accept it because it was like given to our ancestors at Sinai. And I'm wondering, just like, I don't know, what's the like traditional answer for that one, or what's your answer?
There isn't really a good traditional answer. You know, I have this. You can look at my website. I share called "Why is the Torah Still Binding?" Where I go through some of the answers. None of them are terribly satisfying. You know, they all have to work on some kind of notion that of like identity that transfers through time, which we do in various ways. You know, there's an interest that some people love that all Jewish souls were present at Sinai, but then you know the Kedai Yitzchak said that souls can't make binding commitments. Only embodied souls can. So that doesn't work at all. Right? There are people who argue that there must be some kind of premise that an oath. There must be some kind of pre-Torah premise that an oath is binding. And we took an oath, but then how any kind of oath, right? That part of the Halakhic concept that shows up is a debate about whether a parent can take an oath as binding on children. There isn't a really great. There's some really terrible answers. Those are better than terrible answers. If you want to hear the terrible answers, you gotta listen to the share. So.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
We're going to take a break for 10 minutes. If anyone has experience like with setting things up for Zoom meetings, I'd really appreciate that. Okay.
What do you need?
Okay.
Do you want to mute it while we talk? I mean, not that anything she could have
It's probably hard to hear. I feel like the background audio is going to be hard to hear. I don't know. Hi, we're gonna get started with the next talk by Rabbi Jonah Weiner, who's a friend of mine. Rabbi Jonah Weiner currently serves as the director of learning at Shua. He was born and raised in Toronto, and after earning a BA in religious studies at McGill University, he was ordained by Yeshivat B'nai Torah in New York City. While there, he worked as rabbinic intern at NYU's Bronfman Center in the Kehillah of Riverdale. After ordination, he spent 3 years working at Hillel's, most recently as senior Jewish educator and Orthodox rabbi at Brown RISD Hillel. And Jonah lives in Providence, Rhode Island, with his wife, Rabbi Emily, who serves as a rabbi of the congregation of Beit Shalom. Their daughters, Sela and Amunah, and dog, Barley. Jesse, is the recording? We're going to start recording and then...
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad to be here learning some Torah with all of you. This is so wonderful. And I appreciate the Mazel Tov. Yes, the younger daughter is only 6 weeks old. So it's really, nice to be back in the game of teaching a little Torah after a little break. It's really delightful. I also just want to say that the learning today, I'm just double checking the names should be in memory of 2 children, Palestinian children who were murdered in the West Bank today. Othman and Mohammed Bani Odeh, who was Neshamot Shehaf Aliyah. I have sort of a complicated question that I'm interested in this moment. I'm hoping we can be a little dialogical about this. So I'm going to ask questions that are, I don't believe in Socratic questions most of the time, so I'm hoping for real answers to questions that I'm going to ask, and hopefully we can sort of work through some of these things together. I have a question about power, which is that I'm not totally sure what it is. I work at a membership organization that ostensibly we're like building power, we're trying to do something with it. Talked to a lot of organizers about power. I feel like I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm still somewhat befuddled. So I wanted to bring a few sources that set out what my challenge with power is, and a few sources that have, I think, some helpful suggestions, resolutions, ideas to sort of orient us towards some liberatory thinking about it. But I want to situate you all in my discomfort around power, and then hopefully we can build up from the pit I'm going to try and put us into together. Okay, I hope that works. And I'm getting over a little bit of aforementioned children-induced cold, so apologies if I'm a little quiet. If you can't hear me, feel free to ask me to be louder or slower or any of those things. The first source I have on the source sheet is from the Kuzari. I'll say also it's in English because I don't speak Arabic, the language in which it was written. And the other thing that I'm usually pretty good about, which is purging all of the these and thous from sources which don't need to be there. I don't mess with the translations of things if I don't know what the original says. So I assume one could have made those into yous and stuff like that, but I usually do my best to not mess things up. I'm gonna read the first part and then I'm gonna ask a question about it. So in the Kuzari, there's this imagined king of the Khazars, Al-Khazar, who's considering converting to either Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And he has a dialogue with each of a representative of each faith. And the rabbi who he dialogues with, this sort of pedagogical conversation that they have is sort of this book, the Kuzari. And there's sort of back and forth, there's lots of questions and answers. It's interesting in a lot of ways. I'm not incredibly expert in it, but I would say this source has been pulled out in my life many times. I think it's a really fascinating one. So at the end of their first of, I think 5, if I remember right, sort of dialogues, towards the end of the first one, there's sort of the first explicit criticism of the other 2 options of Christianity and Islam as options for this king to convert to. The rabbi says, he's either called the rabbi or the chaver in the text, goes back and forth. And again, apologies for the old English that sounds clunky, at least to my ear. The rabbi says, I see thee reproaching us with our degradation and poverty, us being the Jews. But the best of other religions boast of both. Do they not glorify him who said, he who smites thee on the right cheek, turn to him the left also, and he who takes away thy coat, let him have thy shirt also, right? Both of those being from the Gospels. He and his friends and followers, after hundreds of years of continually flogging and slaying, attained their well-known success, and just in these things they glorify. This is also the history of the founder of Islam and his friends, who eventually prevailed and became powerful. The nations boast of these, but not of these kings whose power and might are great, whose walls are strong, whose chariots are terrible. Yet our relation to Hashem, to God, is closer than if we had reached greatness already on earth. Right? Okay. They talk about how, there's wonderful ethical traditions in Islam and Christianity, but they've spent, varying amounts of time trying to link with the religion, brutally murdering each other and also us, and doing all sorts of horrific oppressions. And then the Khazar king responds with one of only a couple times in the text where he makes a point that the text itself admits there isn't a good response to. He says, that might be so if your humility were voluntary, but it's involuntary. If you had power, you would slay, he says, back to the representative of Judaism, which is both the title of this year because I think it's a great line and also it's very funny in its English translation. Before we read his response to it, here's my question. If you had power, you would slay. What is he saying? What is the power he's saying? If you had X, if you had some kind of thing, you would use it to kill people also? Like, what is power in his mind? What is he saying? This is a real question. I'm genuinely curious if anyone has a thought.
The power to kill?
Right. Amazing. Right. What does power mean? Power is the ability to hurt other people. You Jews are so high and mighty about your ethical tradition too, but you know what? You haven't had the opportunity to hurt people. If you had the opportunity to hurt people, you would be just as bad as everyone else, right? Christianity and Islam, as religious traditions, they're approximately similar. They just had greater opportunity to harm other people, and so they've harmed other people more. I love the response because I think it's brilliant in its total non-response nature, and as a rabbi, we love a non-response. He says, oof, you got our weak spot, O king of the Khazars. If the majority of us, as you say, would learn humility towards God and his law from our low station, providence would not have forced us to bear it for such a long period of time. Oh, it's only because we haven't done whatever the work that we're feeling that we're stuck in this situation. Only the smallest portion thinks thus. The majority may expect a reward because they bear their degradation, partly from necessity, partly of their own free will. Whoever wishes to do so can become the friend and equal of his oppressor by uttering one word, meaning converting, and without any difficulty. Such conduct does not escape the just judge. Okay, there's like a lot packed in there, right? First of all, sadly, on naivete, I'm not even certain if this is true in 1139 when this text was written, but the ease of ability to convert and then no longer be oppressed at all, sadly is not true, but that's the response. I'm totally fascinated by that sort of dialogue. First he says okay, you're right, and also I understand that this is the weakest part of my argument, so I'm gonna immediately drop it, which is sort of fascinating that he would include in his own book his own weakest argument and have himself be called out about it. Like there's something brilliant and interesting there that I sort of think is worth putting a pin in, because I think it's worth putting a pin in when people are brilliant. But the other piece is that he says and we could escape, right? He says our sort of material degradation, whatever that is, our inability to harm other people, right? That's actually really kind of a choice. Because if we wanted, we could stop being Jewish, right? He could, apparently with a word, convert to Islam or Christianity. Let's imagine that were totally true for a minute and whatever, divorce ourselves from the historical context for just 1 second, accept its argument. Let's say that were totally the case and one could completely escape anti-Semitism and immediately be totally absorbed into the more powerful dominant culture, right? So he's saying that then being subject to oppression is our choice, and then our real choice is to be subject to oppression, right? To be at the whims of people who can hurt other people, who have power, or to be absorbed into that majority group who, as our friend over here said, right, have therefore the power to hurt and kill other people, right? Those are the choices though, right, as set up. Either opportunity to hurt people and therefore you will, or oppression by those people, but also not be hurting people, right? That's the dynamic that the Khazari sort of imagines everyone as being bound in. That's unbelievably depressing to me, I guess I'll just say. I don't think that's true about the world, but I think it's very sad to think that that's true about the world. And I don't want to live in that dynamic at all. I will also say that when I look around at the world, I sadly often see that, because of my own, deep connection to Eretz Yisrael and many family members who live there, who I love, and seeing that happen there has been a tragedy and an agony for me, and also in all sorts of other, positions of communal life. So I want to just sort of flag that I don't think this is a universal constant, but boy, does it happen a lot. I think this observes something very true about the universe. I'm going to quote, I often don't quote people who are alive. I feel complicated about doing it in some ways. So I just want to sort of frame, not that conceptual anyone would do this, but I'll just say before I do this, I'm bringing something as a quote of an example that I strongly disagree with the ideology behind. And I just want to ask people to be my accountability partners in making any disagreements be with the content rather than anything about the individual who I'm about to quote next. Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who runs the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel, has this quote in an essay he wrote in 2022. That date is important for lots of reasons, but in 2022 about Israel. And he wrote this sort of at the height of the anti-judicial coup protest movement. He wrote this essay in Hartman's journal. As an Israeli, I appreciate the gifts that Israel's power has afforded my people and me. As a Zionist, I value power and embrace it. I recognize that power is a means, a necessary one, but not an end in itself. It is also one of the central answers to the question of why Israel is important in my life, and what I believe it contributes to the Jewish people. By granting the Jewish people access to power, Israel has made it possible for us to shape our future. Israel has redeemed us from the indignity of powerlessness, of living off the grace and whim and will of others. As an Israeli, I embrace the fact that I have a voice and the power to support that voice in shaping my life and determining my future. So I want to ask the same question I asked. What is he saying that power is? Like, what's power here? Yeah.
Well, the cynical answer is the exact same thing.
Can you say a little bit more? I feel, yeah, the power to hurt people. Okay, yeah, where do you see it here?
The military power of the state.
Yeah. Can you tell me where you see that in the source? Like, can you draw it out for me a tiny bit more?
Yeah.
Because I think it's a really good answer, and I want you to say it.
Just from the indignity and powerlessness, living off the grace, will, and will of others. What's the nafkamina between Israel and anything else? Guns.
Right. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Right. The ability. Right. There's a piece of this that the situation of indignity is not being able to harm other people, and therefore being subject to potential harm from others. Right. The terrible suffering that we've had throughout our history, and the redemption from that indignity is the ability to protect ourselves from that harm, and therefore also to impose that harm on other people. Right. That's power. Yeah.
Well, I mean, nafkamina also includes a heavy role, like I have the biggest role in government and political power and political authority and like majority power.
Right. There's like all of these other dimensions of power, right? Which is like when I imagine my previous incarnation of my work that I imagined myself doing before Rabbi became the thing that I do was I worked for I'm Canadian, I worked for a Canadian political party. And the framework that I was in of power that we wanted is we needed to win elections in order to, guarantee a slightly larger share of the vote and gain the balance of power for the Social Democratic Party in Canada. That was like the actual goal, right? No one was talking about, oh good, they might require our votes in parliament so we can use that ability to hurt anyone. The goal was to build power so that we could make dental care free. Like that was the point. That was the goal. Please God, we're on the road there. But still, that's power, right? There's all of these other things. I also want to draw out that something you were sort of raising there. He makes this point that I think is very ambiguous, but I'm very interested in. I'm sure if I wrote a memo or something, he could say more about it. But he says, where is the line that I love? About determining our future. Yes. Israel's made it possible for us to shape our future. I'm totally fascinated by what that means, in that prior to the advent of Zionism, did we not have that ability to shape our future? Was our future shaped only by others previously? Right? Is power the ability to control what we do as a community? Yeah.
And I think related to that, and maybe this is sort of saying that the Kuzari and Daniel Hartman kind of agree, is that it sounds like the determining the future is because you will always be victorious over your enemies. Like that's sort of what I'm picking up on, is that like in the first one, the problem is that you have enemies that can subdue you.
Right.
And in the second one, you theoretically don't. And at least what is alluded to when Al-Khazari responds is that I think if you had power who would slay is sort of not necessarily you can inflict your violence, but it's you to protect your edifice of power, you would inflict violence.
Right.
So sort of thinking about how you evaluate the obstacles to your power or continued power is sort of the thing I'm thinking about.
I think that's super interesting, because then you get a split of what power means, right? There's one kind of power that's the ability to do whatever the things we want to do, right? That's, me saying it's, Torah values that children should get free dental care, or whatever it is, right? And there's one kind of power that says, I should have the physical ability to prevent someone from taking our, excellent dental care, or whatever it is, from our community that's decided that. And like, that's two very different visions of like what power is. Yeah, please.
It seems to me that that his understanding of power is the ability to be oneself, like power is identity, which is, I think, honestly, more cynical reading than saying that nothing's changed in 1,000 years.
Can you say more about that, please?
If you are not the sovereign, if you are not in the majority, if you are not in power, you're not even yourself. You're fake.
I think that to me, first of all, I completely agree with you, and I think that's somewhat the idea that's underlying the redeem this from the indignity piece that he's sort of talking about here, that the prior indignity is the inability to sort of like be our most full authentic selves, and therefore the ability, right, the sovereignty, the monopoly of violence, the whatever the things you need to create that community, right, that's the thing. And so, right, if one reads many an early Zionist writer, right, you see there's this whole idea of like the new Jew and Eretz Yisrael, all that stuff, I think binds up fundamentally in this idea, or the last Jew, the first Hebrew, right, if you Google it, you'll get lots of interesting things. But like this idea of like our most authentic identity, it requires the ability to do more physical violence than anyone else in the same space as us, to keep ourselves safe. To therefore, be whatever we're gonna be. Yes?
I'm finding it very interesting that he doesn't actually articulate any enemies here.
Mm-hmm.
He just, I think borrowing from you, Jesse, that he's talking about self-determination in this classical Western, self-determination is great and we just need an army to protect our self-determination. But like, protect it from what? There could be any threat, there could be no threat, there could be an amorphous, but it's really just self-determination.
Right.
In that classical liberal tradition.
And it's a really, that's a great point. And it's a really specific image of what, exactly to what you're saying. Tell me if I'm not mirroring you accurately, but it's a very specific vision of what self-determination is, right? Like when I imagine sort of like the full spectrum of ways in which people can be, self-determining, in which people can sort of like express their full identities and selves and communities, like having a state built around that identity is one of the ways, right? It's a very popular mode in our world today. But I'm not so like intellectually bankrupt that I'm like, and there are no other ways, right? You could imagine all sorts of ways for someone to express, their community. We could think of all sorts of things, right? Maybe they're better, maybe they're worse. They have other trade-offs. But I don't know. I think I could think of a few that are different than that. Maybe they also require, military power, but maybe they don't. Yeah,
I think there's something that's a little bit different from just the ability to enact violence on others, because I think like if you look at the Purim story, that is a time when Jews are allowed to enact violence, but I think Hardman would still say they were still living off the grace of the ruler.
Right.
And that's the dignity of powerlessness is like having to appeal to some sort of, it might be different in a democracy, but traditionally in Jewish history, like having some sort of sovereign who you can exercise power through, but first you have to like declare your fealty to them.
Right. I feel like the piece of the Purim story that I'll say jumped out to me most this year, even in my new parent sleep, lack of sleep addled brain, was the sort of like state-sanctioned nature, like whatever, of the violence at the end of the Megillah read to me more than ever as sort of like a state-sanctioned paramilitary kind of a thing than it ever has before. There's this sort of like horrifying thing where it's like, oh yes, you're allowed to organize yourselves into a military organization that will defeat these anti-Semitic, whatever enemies. It just, that piece hit me quite differently this year. The fact that there's like royal assent for that specifically. And whatever, you could read that all sorts of ways, right? Maybe that's a critique of it, maybe it's not. There's all sorts of interesting things to say about the Megillah, but right, totally, that they're still being channeled there. So maybe the redemption from that particular indignity, right? Why don't we say Hallel and Purim somewhat famously, because we're still under the dominion of Achashverosh at the end of the story, right? The happy resolution is we don't get murdered, which is, that's great, but we also weren't being murdered at the beginning of the story. So, we've come back full circle. It's not really like a redemption in some ways. Yeah, please.
It seems like both of these sources, in addition to the core story that you brought up, are framing power not as a new idea, but as sort of flipping as the game that had been played where you were the ones being oppressed, into now you get to be the oppressor, but it's still believing this idea of power as a zero-sum game where someone has to lose in order for someone else to win, which I would like to think is not the only way that we can exist, but it seems like both are brought in on that.
I'm so happy you said that. That is like, if I could distill down the thing I want to talk about that like interests me the most, is like, yes. My big fear about power is that we often are trapped in a dynamic where it's zero-sum, someone has to lose. I'm thinking about how much I want to say this, knowing that this is recorded, but that's okay. I think I feel totally comfortable saying this. As a former Hillel rabbi, and all the Hillels I worked at are wonderful, and I love collegiate Jews. They're amazing, and they do all sorts of wonderful things. And every caveat I could possibly give about that, I'll say something that is really difficult, is that there's like a sort of hegemonic, in the context in which I have worked, there is a sort of like hegemonic imposition on what the limits of political discourse are allowed to be, right? And there's like real pressure to not stray outside of those. And I had a really wonderful conversation with a student a few years ago who, they said to me, and whatever, everyone is entitled to sort of like think through their fantasies of the left attaining power and what we would do if we could do everything. But they were sort of like, could you imagine a universe in which there was a Hillel where Zionist students were treated the way anti-Zionist students are treated? Could you imagine if the sort of political power was completely flipped? They were like, no, it's inconceivable to me. We would be like amazing pluralists about it. We would like have such a I was like, what are you talking about? Right? I was very beautiful. The student had really wonderful values, and I appreciate them deeply, and they're going to be a great leader of Jewish people. And of course, I can picture a different set of viewpoints being thrust upon people, right? In Boston specifically, I'm thinking about that fascinating study of the Boston Jewish community, looking at sort of political attitudes, among other things. That sort of showed the relationship to Zionism shaking out in all sorts of ways here. And a question I have about the future, as it feels like the landscape is shifting, and please God, there's more room than ever to have like ethically serious conversations in the Jewish community. I'm hopeful about what can be done with power, and I'm really, really afraid of what it will be. I think we've seen what sort of a total absence of like real commitment to pluralism on some of these things looks like, and I don't like it. I really, really don't like it. So I'm trying to figure out what can be a liberatory alternative to we have power and therefore we oppress other people, or other people have power, therefore they oppress us. That's like my big stress. Lest you think that this is in any way a new concern, I brought, this is 1.5 more sources before we start to get to some liberatory solutions. I love this Gemara because it's totally shocking. It's wonderful and horrifying. There's like a ton of interesting, if anyone's like fascinated by this, I'm happy to send a couple articles about it because it's contextually, like, there's so much to it that's amazing. But basically the very short version of the context one needs is that there is an intense fight that sort of rests on very fundamental principles about like what halacha is trying to do in the universe between Shammai and Hillel. And there is this shock of a moment where Shammai find themselves in the majority for the first time ever. Not in like we can extract a compromise majority, in like a real majority. Like they have more guys than Hillel for a vote, and like they're gonna win. And like what do they do with that ability? So that's the sort of like broad context for this in the Bavli. Shammai basically says, if you keep pushing on me, trying to get me to compromise, I'll go further. I'll entrench my position sort of more strongly than I did before. The specifics are not so important to this unless you really want to get into it, so I'm gonna, put parentheses around it, but it's extremely worth getting into it because every commentator like pulls out all these fascinating threads and reads the story very, very differently in sort of beautiful ways. Then they go and they stick a sword in the Beit Shammai, put a sword at the entrance to the Beit Midrash, and they say, if you want to come in, you can come in. If you want to leave, you can't leave. We will, presumably, by putting a sword there, we'll kill you, right? Like that's it. We are using the system in this way. Then this is the piece that sort of like gets to me. Hillel, Hillel was like bowed over low in front of Shammai. He was bowed over in front of him like one of his students. Like their sort of like relationship was fundamentally altered. There's like this like performance of dominance that happens. This was as difficult for the Jewish people as the day that the golden calf was built. And they decreed, right? Shammai and Hillel made a bunch of decrees. The vote goes forward. Shammai wins on 18 things that are interesting but not important to get into in this moment. And they make these decrees. And you know the way that the Torah worked at that moment and Halacha worked then was, all right, they were voted on, that's it, it's done. These are halachot. These 18 things have become halacha. And nobody accepts it. It doesn't do anything. Until the students of Shammai and Hillel both also sort of decree, all right, these decrees are valid. And then the people accept those decrees. And I want to give one more half source from the Yerushalmi here, which is even more shocking. It doesn't say they put a sword in the Beit Midrash. It says the students of Shammai, that the voting takes place in an attic for interesting reasons. But the students of Shammai are downstairs and they kill enough students of Hillel to guarantee a continued majority and to stop them from going up to where the voting is taking place, to continue guaranteeing Shammai their majority, to like get through as many agenda items as possible until they can't guarantee that anymore. So, whatever, this is like a horrifying and shocking story in a lot of ways. Also, you know it's like really good because like half of the commentators, we don't have so many commentators in the Yerushalmi in general, but many of the commentators who we do have immediately say this is metaphorical. They weren't literally killing them, right? There's no way, but I don't know. Anyone who has better Aramaic than me is welcome to take a look at it. It says they're killing them. So you can do with that as you like. What sort of pulls at me about this is, right, when we think about power, right? What have Shammai done here? They have discovered they are in power for the first time. What kind of power are they in? Voting majority power, right? There's a legitimate process for the way halachot are decided, and they won for once. They've been totally excluded from the system, maybe occasionally, right? On a few halachot, we put the mezuzah at an angle for them, right? They get these like tiny little crumbs of concession, and for once they get actual power, right? And they're like, great, we're gonna wield our power, right? And the wielding of that power is not only a disaster, but then they're like, we need to hold on to the power that we've now grasped for about 1 second. And it's either a sort of implied, right, the sword in the entrance to the Beit Midrash, a threat of violence. At least that's how the Agada reads to me. Or in the Yerushalmi's version, actual, literal, like using violence to continue that they control the system. And then what's sort of the most radical is that the system totally breaks. People say, oh, well, these halachot are not legitimate. You use power to, you use violence to guarantee, maybe, for whatever reason, this doesn't read as legitimate to the Jewish people. They don't accept these halachot until people come along and say, no, we have to maintain the system, right? The students of both sides agree to these rules continuing to be real halachot, and they're passed down. This is sort of my like nightmare scenario of power in some ways, right? That this like horrific abuse gets like, of the system, then gets somehow like normalized back into it as, oh, this was an extraordinary thing, this happened one time, we're gonna like keep going, right? This could be okay. Parenthetically, right, when I think about some of my big fears for America's future, right, the like horrific violence and abuses of this moment being some way normalized, right, saying, oh, actually these things were legitimate, we're not gonna prosecute the people who did, whatever horrific thing, right? I have tremendous fear of that as an outcome. And I think the story in some ways points to it, right? This continuity of the system, I'm an Orthodox Jew and an Orthodox Rabbi. To me, the continuity of the system is very important. I care tremendously that the students of Hillel accepted these halachot, and I'm totally terrified about what it says about how things work. I'm very grateful we don't vote on halakha anymore for a lot of reasons, but this is one of them. I want to offer some non-depressing sources. I want to move to things that suggest some alternatives. I'll also say that I don't have real solutions, right? I have like what I read as like sweet and fluffy in some ways solutions, but I think they sort of point us towards some sort of like ideological alternatives. I know it can feel absurd, and as it occasionally does to me, to sort of speculate about the like what should we do with power, what should power mean, what are we actually like aspiring to when we do the kind of organizing that we do, like what are we hoping for? It can feel somewhat silly to have that conversation when we are so removed from power. in lots of ways, it feels really important to me. It feels really, really important to me to like come in with a strong vision and like deeply rooted values so that we can do the right things. I totally believe that there is, over some horizon, the ability to enact like a really beautiful and just vision for the Jewish future, and please God, the world's future as well. And like, I think we actually need to be ready for that in a serious way for us to be able to do it. So I'll say that that's like the thing that's motivating us, is like an actual material consideration about like what should the world look like and what should it look like when any of the people in this room or folks who share our values are able to like shape the world, whether, you know, in the smallest ways or in huge ways. I have someone, I think my next source is from someone who's become somewhat celeb recently, in a very small way, Rabbi Tamaris, because many of his works were recently translated, somewhat recently. In my mind it's recent, maybe it was like 6 or 7 years ago. The book in English, if this strikes you, is I think called A Passionate Pacifist, I want to say. Yes, I'm getting a nod from Rabbi. That collects a bunch of his major writings. Also, Lima Books in Israel has put out a few of his collections of writings, which is how I first encountered him. And he's wonderful. He's a post-World War I Polish-Ukrainian border region writer who is a brilliant political thinker and wonderful rabbi, and just has amazing things to say, and says them with so much more chutzpah than I've ever heard anyone. It's amazing. It's great. I also have to apologize very quickly for one thing, which is that for the first time in my life, I used like an OCR reader to take text from like my tiny book into like an actual source sheet, and I noticed like 2 different typos on the train here. So I'll just say apologies for any typos in this. You know, I'm learning technologies. I'm gonna live mostly in the English for this one because it's long and also the translation is good, and I know the translation is good because I did it and I feel pretty good about it. If you quibble about it, I'm totally open to that. I'm not a master translator, and I would always love to improve this because I see myself using this source a few more times. The essay this is from is unbelievable. It's really interesting. It's extremely good. The essay is called Knesset Yisrael, the Milchamot HaGoyim, the community of the Jewish people and the wars of the non-Jews. It's about his responses to World War I and the way in which he thinks it discredits all political violence forever, and he feels that this is sort of the dawning of a messianic age where everyone in the world will have seen how horrible and destructive war is, which, you know, what are you gonna do? He saw it, that's beautiful, that's really wonderful that he had that insight. Hopefully more people soon. He's talking about like what's the situation and the role of Jewish people in the world, especially in this world, right? He had a complicated and interesting relationship with Zionism, but he's sort of trying to figure out like what are we supposed to do as Jewish people who are situated in this. And he says, for the time being, indeed, we're reviled in the mouths of all the nations because of the example and the sign that we present. They call us by the name accursed Jew, wandering Jew, right? All these, you know, very common epithets for Jewish people, more common in the past. And he goes, but we don't resent it. There's nothing wrong with being, you know, Yudim Aror, right? With being accursed Jews. He says, for so long as the nations have not been illuminated from on high by the pure spirit for which we hope, they're justified in reviling us and calling us by the name accursed. For from their point of view, we are accursed. We lack many kinds of blessings. Accursed from the lack of the blessing, by your sword shall you live. For lots of reasons, I think it's particularly incredible that that's his example of the worst possible blessing for a person to get, that Esau gets. And accursed in that we have no altars of our own in which to offer our own sacrifices and after perform over them. I don't know what Chidot are, he helpfully translates for us, or at least in my edition it does. That's memorial prayers for the dead. And recite over them brachot, like they should rest in peace. Quotes Isaiah about it, right? Non-Jews are totally right to curse us. We don't have the amazing blessings they have, like the ability to kill people, right? Or the ability to offer animal sacrifices. He's like, yeah, great. You know, that's only a curse from this external perspective, right? That doesn't see some kind of enlightenment in our lack of ability to kill people. From their perspective, the nations are justified in reviling us, and this they don't harm us in the least. For their, sadly, you know, for their reviling is, on the contrary, a good sign and a favorable confirmation of our essence. If those who wage wars and generate corruption call us accursed, it's a sign that we are the seed of whom the Lord has blessed. Right? That our inability to harm people is a huge blessing. Right? If we could hurt people, we probably would. And that would be terrible. Our real blessing is our inability to actually, or our, you know, lack of choosing perhaps to kill other people. That's the real blessing. And he says, and they'll continue to revile us for so long as they remain on their present level, until they realize killing people is terrible. First of all, now he turns to like, what are we supposed to do then? First of all, we must be learners. This is even more beautiful in Hebrew. And when we become learners with intention and with vigorous diligence, then we'll be able to become teachers without intending it, without even being aware of it. Which, first of all, I think is like a very beautiful mission statement in general, of not trying to sort of paternalistically teach people things, but trying to be a good example of a human being in the world, trying to be thoughtful, trying to learn, trying to grow. Something very like lovely about that's what he thinks, being an Or Lagoim is, being a light into the nations, is to like work on yourself forever, and hopefully that influences other people to do the same. He says, thus in striving to preserve the existence of our nation and its distinctive culture, we thereby render the most beneficial service to the world at large, by presenting before it a model nation that embodies the doctrine of the firstborn right of the human being, his holding and his inheritance. By which he means, in some way, like powerlessness and Torah. Powerlessness in one sense of what power is. To maintain and to guard with the utmost vigilance the existence of our nation in exile, the existence of the model nation, is therefore the universal mission that we have in the diaspora. It was not in order to spread the parchment-written Torah that we went out into exile and were scattered among the nations, but rather in order to cultivate and sustain before the world diasporic Jewish nation, a living interpretation of the Torah. There will be no future and no hope for the Torah of Israel unless there exists in the world a Jewish nation in exile. And I'll say he goes further than this in a really interesting way. I said he has a complicated relationship to Zionism. He shows up at the 4th Zionist Congress, I want to say, maybe 3rd, I can never remember off the top of my head, and then leaves in disgust over some things, and then he shows up at the next one. He has this, he corresponds with everyone, like all the people in this milieu, they're all yelling at each other over letters and in these journals all the time that many of them are participating in. He has this very complicated relationship. He feels very comfortable with Jews living in Eretz Israel. He feels that is in no way a contradiction to exile. He's a wonderful, just parenthetically, he has, I think, one of the most concise and beautiful descriptions of exile in the same essay. It's chapter 7 or 8. It's fabulous. He talks through what he thinks it means to be in Galus in a way that I find very powerful. But it's not about where you are physically located, to say the least. What I want to ask about this source is, okay, this isn't maybe the same as the sort of zero-sum power to hurt and therefore you will, or lack of that and therefore oppressed zero-sum thinking. But what's power for Rav Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, at least from the source? I know it's a long one, I'm sorry for giving what a humongous chunk of text. Please.
It seems like he wants us to hold in our minds this perspective that we don't have power, that we're in exile and subject to the wishes of others, even if we're in a state of having power, that we should still remember what it's like to not have power, and the implication is then not use that power against others.
Right, that there should always be some kind of, and please tell me if I'm not hearing this well, right? There should always be some kind of exile consciousness or something there. But that's you have to remember what it is to be without the ability to hurt people all the time, and then the actual ability to harm people or not is somewhat immaterial.
Which is right.
Yeah, right, totally, right? The Torah says, he's saying it because the Torah says it. Totally. The other thing I would say is that I think he has this very subtle, but to me quite powerful notion of okay, maybe I'm saying power too many times, it's really infiltrated the vocabulary, but this notion of what is our ability to have power, to enact our vision, right, to be ourselves, maybe to come back to the conversation we were having earlier, right? He seems to think that what's actually powerful is we should learn Torah, we should be good people, we should be learners forever, not try and make other people be like us, but try and be really great people who people are wow, there's something special going on there and I have an influence. I don't know, when I think about the things that have shaped me personally, just to put my own cards on the table, it's often seeing the incredible power of teachers of mine and Rabbeim who have incredible humility or incredible wisdom, incredible values, things like that. There are lessons and pieces of Torah I have learned from Rabbeim over decades that I remember exactly how they said it in exactly the context because it made a real impact on me. And I don't know if they were trying to be so overtly pedagogical in every second. I just think they were great examples. And that's humongous power. That's a tremendous, I don't know. I can't be the only one who left those shiurim and felt moved in a real way to be I should think about this differently. I should think about how I am in the world in a different way. And I think he's sort of saying there is a kind of power that is not about forcing anyone to do anything, but is about being who you are in the sort of most profound sense and sort of being in that journey. So I think that's one potential out from this sort of trap of zero-sum notion of power. I'm going to offer another one, which I also love. It's from Avram Yehuda. I will give the caveat, which is that I'm in no way an expert in Chabad Hasidus, and Chaim actually totally is, and I am not. Other Hasidus I know much better, but Chabad has always been very difficult for me, and I bounced off a few times. So I'll say that if there's a piece I'm missing of this, of context, it's probably something related to that. If anyone here is and reads this and knows way more about it, I would delight in being enlightened about this. He is a sort of fascinating figure. He had a pulpit shul in Paris where he met the Lubavitcher Rebbe when the Rebbe was starting to become an electrician in France. So he had this whole thing. He's actually, I think, the first, if I know my history right, I think he's the first, maybe the second Chabad rabbi with a pulpit to call for the last Lubavitcher Rebbe to become the Rebbe after his predecessor died. So there's all these interesting things. They corresponded for years. The thing I would say is notable for is being very, very, very outspoken pacifist and feeling that that is the basic foundation of the Jewish tradition. He wrote this book that is available online. That's a sort of collection of all his writings called the Malchut HaYahadut in the Kingdom of Judaism. It's great. It's very weirdly organized. He wrote about extremely eclectic topics, and in essays you would maybe never think had anything to do with any of these things, he has these incredible lines that are gorgeous. So in this essay where he's defending Nachum Mendel Bayless, who was a Russian Jew who was, there was a blood libel against him. It created this whole controversy in Tsarist Russia that led to all sorts of horrific oppression of the Jews. Actually, he dedicates the essay to the non-Jewish defense lawyer in the case who defended Nachum Mendel Bayless. It's very sweet. I don't think I've ever seen a Halachic essay before recent modernity dedicated to someone non-Jewish, which I thought was very interesting. So he has this whole thing about sort of the blood libel and how horrible and wrong it is. And then as part of that discussion about how awful and how abhorrent to Judaism it is to kill people, he gives this passage. He quotes the somewhat famous. Okay, right, they're gonna beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, right? And nation won't lift up sword against nation, and they won't learn war anymore, right? From Isaiah and Micah. He quotes these beautiful lines we've heard a bunch of times. Now this is his reflection on that, and I think it's important. The date here also is very important because he's saying this in 1917, right? So there's all sorts of difficulty and intercommunal violence going on around sort of the British colonial project in the Middle East, and especially around Jewish and Palestinian relationships going on there. So there's a lot happening there at the moment, but there's obviously no state yet. So when he says Israel here, he means the Jewish people, and he has this incredible line. Lo kvod היהודי, ולא ניצחון לאומי, ולא דגל ישראל מונף בכל נמלים, כי אם ביטל עצם תופת ניצחון. I'm just noticing my periods ended up on the wrong side there. That's okay. He says that, right, it's not the honor of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish weapons, or it's not some kind of national victory. It's not the flag of Israel, the flag of the Jewish people raised in every port in the world, but the abolition of the concept of victory. He's saying this is Isaiah's vision. Right? Isaiah doesn't say, and then the Jews will take over the earth or something like that. That's not our messianic prophecy. It's the abolition of this concept of victory at all. Right? There will be a sort of complete, dissolution of the concept. Right? The use of the word Torah here actually I think is very interesting. There's you could have said this in other ways, but whatever the sort of instruction of war, the teaching of war, at all as a concept that exists in the universe. Right? That's what's going to happen. Right? Right? This is the fundamental longing of Judaism is the abolition of the weapon itself. It's not that we shouldn't have weapons and other people shouldn't have weapons. It's this should be an unthinkable concept to us. Right? And he quotes again, right? And they shall no longer teach each man his neighbor, each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all of them shall know me, from the smallest and the greatest of them. And neither shall they harm or destroy, for the earth shall be full of knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. It's a great pasuk. And he says, this is where I think he gets sort of even more radical, right? It's not just that advantage of like one person over another, that one person's going to be stronger than somebody else, but the basic notion of that advantage at all, right, is the cause of violence. Even spiritual advantage, right? Because the great and the small will both know Hashem the same. There'll be some kind of like equanimity with regard to like Torah knowledge. Everyone will have this like divine, intimate knowledge of Hashem, and there won't be any great and small. There won't be any weak and mighty, right? The whole dynamic will go, not in the material and not in the spiritual. That's what he thinks the goal of Judaism is. The like total abolition of, this is the thing that I have to say, I thought about it a lot during, if anyone has been in Israel the last few years, I was there, with a group of students a year and a half ago, and you see the Halakhic everywhere. It's great victory together, sort of on every possible imaginable surface. And I often thought about this quote from Rabbi about the goal being the sort of abolition of victory, because victory implies that there's a battle and there's a war, right? And the point isn't to win from his perspective. The point is to not be fighting. The point is to have some kind of resolution of that. So I want to offer that as a second sort of possible out from this dynamic, which is like trying to find a way in which we can exist where the dynamic is not one group with power and the power to oppress, one group who does not have that power and is oppressed, or whatever the 1,000 very complicated manifestations of that, but rather the notion that any group is doing oppressing or is being oppressed, right? We need to think in the longest possible term sense about what it means to abolish that fundamental dynamic. For him, it's messianic. I think it's very hard to imagine it not being messianic. And I think it's good, I think there's something beautiful about having a messianic goal that we actually feel good about, of like, what are we trying to do here? Like, what's the point of all of this? I want to end with the last source, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation about it. This is from Mori Rabbi, the Meh Shilach. I cannot extol his virtues enough. He's the Ishbitzer Rabbi. He's a Leidish Hasidic master in Ukraine. He's great. I love him so much. He's so wonderful. And has incredible insights, very off the wall. People overquote like 2 or 3 of his things where he sounds like he's a determinist, which he probably is, and underquote the 99% of his Torah that's just like about other stuff, and it is incredible. So this is his only comment on Rosh Hashanah Tefillah. There are a few places where there's like a rich area of Torah, and he has like one little thing to say. Like he makes one comment on the entire book of Yonah. He makes 2 comments on Esther, but they're both very short. He has these very tiny things, and I think they're often incredible. So this is his comment on Rosh Hashanah Tefillah, and I feel very inspired by it. Also very relevant for our current era. So he quotes the line, right? Right? The righteous will see and rejoice, and the upright will exalt, and the pious will jubilate in song. You can say I didn't translate it myself because I would never use the word jubilate. Will jubilate in song, etc. Right? And we're gonna have this thing be accomplished that we explicitly pray for in Yom Kippur. We're gonna abolish or Hashem will abolish the. Mashal Zidon is sort of hard to translate nicely, but usually we say like the rule of wickedness or evil. Hu Hashem Elokeinu levad al kol mashiach. Right, so Hashem is going to be the only one who's going to reign over the universe. We're going to get rid of all the bad stuff. Okay, now here's his like real thing that he has to say about it. This actually goes directly to what Klapper was saying earlier. Rosh aval imaya kol ha'olam tzadikim lo ya nitzrachim lemelech aval malchut Hashem yitbarach af acharei v'galot kol levado imloch no ra. Right? He says, right now, right? It's not just even after the sort of like rule of wickedness is abolished, and there's no more sort of like evil governing institutions. However one wants to think of those things, both the wickedness in one's own heart and also the wickedness in the world. Excuse me. Nevertheless, despite that, Hashem is still going to be the king. Right? There's some model of kingship that is like outside of whatever this paradigm is. He says, in this world we need a king. In Olam Hazeh, right now, before Olam Haba, we need a king in order to get rid of the wickedness of the wicked, right? There has to be some kind of authority structure in his mind to provide some kind of taming impulse to the world, to guide us to good, whatever one thinks a good monarch could possibly do. Or any governing institution, I would say. Any kind of rulership, I think, is what he's pointing towards. But if everyone were righteous, which is what he imagines the Messianic era being, right, where we're all our best, most holy, most connected versions of ourselves, right, then we wouldn't need a king, because the point of the king is to sort of restrain those evil impulses and to create a structure for us to be in. And yet somehow there's still the kingship of Hashem alone. Even after everything has come to completion, everyone is this redeemed version of themselves as our most authentic and best selves. There's still a concept of kingship for God and God alone. And God alone will reign in awe. What I find so moving about it is that he can imagine, even if it's only sort of projected into a messianic future, there is a dynamic of Hashem having some kind of power that has nothing to do with making anybody do anything, right? Everyone's going to do all the right things. Somewhat famously or infamously, the Ishbitzer Rebbe's vision of the messianic era is this world right now, and everyone just does what's intuitive to them. But the thing that they do intuitively happens to be the will of God, because we've cultivated ourselves so perfectly. He's a very interesting and deep thinker. And I think this is sort of a third option that I think is sort of powerful. He has this, I don't know exactly what it is, but there is this model of power, and it's the model of power that Hashem has, which is some kind of rule that is unrelated to coercing people into not being bad, or coercing people into not doing the things you don't want them to do. There's a relationship, there's something. Whatever our relationship is to God, when we say, right, we don't have any king except the supreme King of Kings. I have a king currently as a Canadian, right? It's not like he's saying, it's not like that king. It's not, the relationship is fundamentally different than that king. Not that that king is preventing anyone from doing anything particularly evil, but whatever. His representatives, His Majesty's government is doing all sorts of things. Also maybe not preventing so much evil, but whatever. All that to say, he's saying that the dynamic relationship between a Jewish person and our real king, our true king, Hashem, that is the model for what some kind of liberatory vision of power could be. And that doesn't have to go away. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing, temporary, there's nothing, problematic about that. He sort of waxes poetic about all the problematics of kingship in other places. And he's very acutely aware of all the ways that can go awry and be sort of negative. And yet, the sort of messianic ideal of it is something that totally transcends that sort of limited notion of king is about hurting whoever you consider the bad guys to be and protecting whoever you consider the good guys to be. Hashem has something better than that. And I'll say I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm very inspired to spend some time thinking about that from this source. It leaves me sort of with right, when I think about the metaphor of Hashem as king, what am I thinking about that? What am I trying to understand from that? And what can that teach me about what I want when I try and have political power and try and build power for things that I think are important? Right? How to instantiate that in a real way. So yeah, please.
Well, first, this is a question if you're moving to talking about all three sources.
Yeah. This is the move to all three sources. If there's something specifically about just this one, happy to stay on it for a second.
So come back to me if you want a question about that.
Okay, great. Yeah,
Yeah, I was wondering if you talked about how Minashua talks about kingship in other places, but how deliberate do you think the language of a king is? He's living after, the American and the French revolutions and is clearly aware that there's an alternative to government to kings. So is he using this deliberately, or do you think he's just using king as a metonym for government?
I think he's using king as a metonym for government, and I think that because a big thing in his thought, and then his the following Rebbes after him in his dynasty, who are the Radziner Rebbes, really developed this way more. But he basically, his model for thinking about Jewishness is he thinks there's a Yosef and Yehuda as the two types that one can be in the universe of Joseph and Judah. And Judah is sort of the monarchical, sort of kingly, sort of powerful impulse in some ways, and Joseph as sort of a extra legal, prophetic, sort of weird other structure. It's very interesting. He has a lot to say about it, but he uses the language of king a lot to talk about. He uses the language of sort of kingship when he's talking about halacha also. So to me, I think he means sort of like, one is much more dynamic and fluid and therefore more dangerous to him in his mind, but also, contains the seeds of, lots of wonderful possibility. And kingship is the much more stable, structured thing that has potential for horror and potential for good also, but both of those are more limited because they're more structured. So I think that's how he usually uses it when he talks about these ideas in Heshilah. But I could totally be wrong. I'm also important to stay open to that possibility. Okay, to move to a broader discussion with my remaining. Oh my God, 1 minute. Oh no, I thought I had more time to talk. I'm sorry. I'm gonna take the same prerogative as Rabbi Klapper, even though my Torah is small by comparison to his. And I'll say if people want to have 1 or 2 questions, I would love to do that. And I'll just conclude by saying, first of all, thank you, and second of all, I hope we continue to do productive thinking about when we, please God, have more power. What is the power that we want, and how are we going to use it, and how are we going to sort of be transformative with it? How can we get out of this crappy dynamic of cyclical violence against one another, and instead transcend that to something better? I hope. I think there's some possibilities, and hopefully some of these sources sort of pushed a little bit. Do people have questions or things they want to talk about? Despite around any of this stuff. Yeah, please.
In your conception of power,
yeah,
and where the Kuzari and everyone else you brought in their description of power as necessarily actualized potential, where's the room for the concept of law generally, or halacha specifically, as restraint in terms of you should not oppress the stranger. You can oppress the stranger, and that's why you shouldn't. But you have the power to oppress the stranger, but don't.
That's great. For numerous reasons, I've spent a bunch of time with Musar the last year and a half working on these things, and I think that there is a real current of that, of power as unactualized, that you could hurt somebody else and you don't. I think that to me, I'll say, being subject to someone else in that way is similarly scary. Of so-and-so, when I think about, for example, Rabbi Klapper brought this up, I think, in a useful way around school prayer, right? If the American government could legislate a prayer to the Christian God in public schools, right, but they choose not to out of their compassion, or because it's not so popular, right? Or because they're good people and they don't want to do that to somebody else, right? But that remains on the table as a legal possibility. To me, I actually still feel oppressed by that. That's not good enough. I feel you put I apologize for the violent metaphor, but putting the gun on the table in front of me and saying, but I'm a good person, so I wouldn't shoot you, that's actually not constructive to me. I want out of the whole fundamental dynamic. But you pushed me to think in a useful way. I feel the next version of this year, I have to have more on that. That's really great. Thank you. I'm sorry that wasn't a great answer, but it was a new thought for me, so I think it's great. Yeah, I'll be back.
I have a question, nobody else has a question, because I'm about to talk for a while.
No, I want to hear your question. I'm sure it's very exciting.
Kind of relatedly, I'm really interested in my encounters with especially our Tamaras, and I haven't met the other guys so much. It's very interesting that they're drawn from Tanakh and davening. And this might be a Hasidus thing that I'm not holding entirely.
Yeah.
But you brought us the only Gemara in your sources, and I'm interested in what you think of what sources they're using and why didn't you not drawing from the more legal parts of Torah.
That's
talking
great.
about power and dominion and what it means to be charged something.
First of all, it's a great question. It's interesting. Rav Chaim, who's the Chabad Chassid, in his I find him a little more circuitous. Rav Shmuel Maris gets to the point a little bit faster, but Rav Chaim has a huge amount. His first essay in his book is literally going through cases in which the death penalty could be applied, and using that as a test case for the way in which he thinks there's no conceivable situation in which Judaism condones taking anybody's life ever, which is a wild thing to assert. If you've spent any time with the Gemara around it, it's just, that's not the obvious, I don't know. He certainly knows more Torah than me, but that's not I would not say that that's the obvious takeaway from spending any time in Masechah Sanhedrin. So if you want to read what I imagine to be an extremely compelling 50-something pages, I'm happy to send you a PDF of it. It's also on Atzar Chachma. It's literally the first essay. It's the one right before actually this essay. Judaism and Blood is the second one in the first volume. I got through maybe 20 pages of it. It's a little pupil for me, but he spends a lot of time there. Regarding Shmuel Maris, I don't it's so funny that it didn't even occur to me. I feel like to put some of my own self on the table here, I'll say, like when I spend time learning for my own joy and not for work and not for, some other external factor, it's all Kabbalah and Hasidus. So there's not a lot of Gemara except when being read extremely allegorically and briefly. So it's so funny that I don't feel like I even noticed it in Ron Shmul's Maras. And as you said, I'm like sort of thinking through the 5 or 6 essays of his that I've spent real time with, and he doesn't spend very much time on Gemara. That's like so interesting. I'm going to be more tuned to that question in the future, because that's very interesting. Thank you for that, Abigail. Yeah, last question, please.
Sure, I think it, like, at least to me, I don't really understand what Tamaris is actually, like, concretely saying. It, like, kind of makes sense that, like, Chaim is saying something messianic. There's sort of, like, this, like, end of, like, war as domination. You have the Meshulach saying that, like, oh no, you're gonna have, like, the supernal king, and, like, you're gonna be shaped by, like, what the supernal king, like, sort of wants, but, like, there isn't, what is the ikar of, like, what Tamaris is saying? It just kind of sounds like that, like, you'll be a exiled nation in cultural continuity as an exiled nation, self-contained doohickey situation.
Yeah. I would say to my at least understanding, when he sort of maps out his own political vision, so I'll say something that's also interesting about him is that he's like, he reads everybody. He's quoting, not only Torah sources, but he goes on at length about how much he loves Kropotkin. Like he has stuff to say. He calls him a neshama tahora. Like he has all these interesting things to say about anarchism. He reads to me sort of and he actually, at the very beginning of this piece, he goes on at length about why he feels the First International failed to prevent World War I, and it discredits communism to him, and he has like all this stuff to say. It's very weird to read in like rabbinic Hebrew. It profoundly threw me off. I had to like keep looking up words and being like, oh, it's the name of a Russian anarchist thinker I've never heard of. I have to ask a best friend to tell me about. So I'll say his vision is he thinks everyone should have a structure like this. What he wants people to learn from the Jewish people is to not have some kind of state telling you what to do. You should be doing some kind of, like mutual aid-based, like cooperation with one another. And when he thinks, like he says, when knowledge of Hashem will fill the world like the sea fills the seabed, right? And he also quotes a favorite midrash of mine, which I really adore, where it says, right, when it talks about Hashem's presence filling the Mishkan, recently in our Torah reading, he says that it's like when a cave by the seabed is full of seawater. The sea isn't any less empty, right? It's just that the cave by the seabed is full at high tide, which is I find very beautiful. He's like, that's what it's going to be like in the Messianic era, that everyone will have what they need because we're all going to sort of contribute, and because there's so much, abundance, he doesn't quite use that language, but like, then it'll all be okay because we're all going to sort of like be in this mutually loving, sort of vision of anarchist collective. I don't know, it's hard to talk through because I know the Torah, I don't know the political thought nearly as much. But he knows both the Torah and the political thought much better than me and articulates sort of like a somewhat clear vision of it. But if you wanna really get into the Tachlis, there's a book called No Masters But God by Chaim Rothman about anarchism and Orthodox thinkers, and both of them appear in it, although whatever.
I tried to read it.
Oh, okay.
I got a friend to get it from the Harvard Library, and I got
it's a fortune.
It's hard.
It's hard, but I'll say that I found the Rav Arnshvild's Paras chapter more readable than other chapters, and Chaim Rothman actually knows about anarchism in a way that I feel I don't, as but a humble rabbi. That's also a great question. Thank you all so much. This is a real pleasure to learn together. And thank you again to and everyone from Off Left for making this happen. I really appreciate all of you. Sorry for stealing your break.
Alright, we're gonna get started with the next talk, and there'll be a little bit of time afterwards. We have the room, until 5:15 or so. So, there's a lot of great conversations going on. But next we're gonna have Rabbi Abigail Halpern. She is a writer and educator focusing on queer and feminist Torah. She is a regular contributor to Jewish Currents Weekly Parsha Commentary, an adjunct Talmud faculty member at Hebrew College, and is currently at work on a book about queer nida and Jewish sexual ethics and law. She has served as a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute and was recognized as one of the New York Jewish Week's 36 under 36 in 2021. I won't read the rest, but she has a Substack that you can look up, that you should subscribe to. It's well worth it.
See the whole bio. I was like, you want a bio?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that you do.
Hi. Hello. My impulse is always to say good Shabbos. Okay. So I want just by a show of hands, how many of you have ever asked a rabbi or someone by another title with rabbinic training a Halakhic question? Okay. Amazing. So majority, but not all. That's excellent. Okay. I want to do popcorn style. Think for a minute, what is a feeling you felt in the process of asking that question? You are allowed one word. I don't want you to tell me the story. I just want you to think about what was it like emotionally at any point. What was an emotion you felt in that process? And just raise your hand when you've got something. And if you have never asked a rabbi a Halakhic question, I would like to also invite you to share what is a feeling you imagine feeling when you think about asking a rabbi a Halakhic question. And if that insofar as you have feelings about it. Yeah, Mimi. Scared. Scared. Awesome. Not awesome, but thank you for your contribution. Yeah.
Trepidation.
Trepidation.
Unsatisfied?
Okay, unsatisfied. Yeah.
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment? Yeah.
I think relief.
Relief, okay. Any last feelings in the room?
Is there anything from the Zoom?
Oh, is there anything in the Zoom chat? No. Okay. Hi, Zoom people. Okay.
Scared works, I guess.
You got scared works. Okay. So we've got a lot of kind of negative emotions coming up here. We got relief, which is I think the most positive emotion that we got in the room. I give a lot of psak, probably more than I rightly ought to give, because people often want psak from someone who shares their identities and or values. Here we are. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately is what does it mean to give psak ethically in a way that is a feminist psak, that is a leftist perspective on psak, because psak in some ways is inherently about a power dynamic, right? There's the person who has the knowledge and the person who's seeking the knowledge. Or we can hit it even more strongly, there's the person who can grant permission or forbid something, and there's the person who's seeking that ruling. So even if it's just an imbalance of knowledge, there's already a power dynamic, but certainly if you have a theology of psak where the reality is created by the psak rather than just described by it, that is very high stakes. Okay, so our source sheet starts out with two Gemaras. I would like a volunteer to read one of them. You'll note I have brought them in the original and in translation. The translation is my edit of the Koren Steinsaltz version on Sefaria. So the bold is direct translation and the not bold is interpolation intended to make things make sense because Aramaic is very sparse. Shira, thank you.
The sages taught, in the case of one who asks a question of a sage with regard to an issue of ritual impurity, and the sage rules that the item is impure, it may not ask the same question of another sage and have him rule that it is pure. Similarly, in the case of one who has asked a sage a Halakhic question and he deems it forbidden, he may not ask the question of another sage and have him deem it forbidden.
Great. This might ring a bell if you are from currently or have spent time in communities that tend to think of psak as a normal activity that regularly run halachic questions by authorities, right? The idea is you go to someone, they say, that pot is treif. You can't be like, oh, I'm not sure that's right. I'm going to go to the other guy and hope he says the pot is kosher. Okay, who is this text about? Who is the text talking to?
The asker.
The asker. Excellent. That's exactly what I was fishing for. This text is about any of us who are going to go ask a rabbi a halachic question. This says if I ask the question and I don't like the answer, I should not go and get a second opinion. Okay, now let's look at the textual clue. Who's going to read this one for us? Alyssa is.
But isn't it taught in the Braita, if a halachic authority deems an item not impure, another halachic authority is not allowed to deem it pure? Likewise, if he prohibited it, another authority is not allowed to permit it?
Great. Okay, so the question mark there is because I've pulled this from a different context where this is trying to prove something, but the context is not relevant for our proof. So who's this text about? Whose behavior is being dictated by this text?
The one being asked.
The one being asked, exactly. The person who I'm going to anachronistically for the Gemara call the posek. So we've got a prohibition for the shoel, for the person who's asking, and for the poseket, for the person who's answering. What's the difference between these? Why do you think we might need both? How does it feel? Do these feel substantively different? Yeah.
Well, the person asking presumably knows that they've already asked someone else and gotten a different answer.
Great.
The person being asked needs to figure out if this person already has an answer from some other authority before being allowed to give an answer to the question.
Great, which could cut two ways, right? We could say, oh, you already asked Rabbi A, so Rabbi B is actually totally not on the hook if Rabbi B doesn't know that the question's already been asked. Or you could say, it's Rabbi B's responsibility to always say, tell me what research you've already done. Tell me how you've been relating to this. I need to ask my good questions and get a kind of a history. And only then can Rabbi B make him suck. Yeah.
There's also a different sort of calculus. For the asker, they genuinely do not have access to the ontological truth. Is
Great.
this incorrect or not?
Excellent.
For the chacham, they know, they might be 100% firmly convinced that someone else is posting wrong.
Right.
And so then the calculation is then, do I correct what I am sure actually was a mistake at the cost of undermining?
Excellent. And an important nafkamina here, an important case that's going to show us distinctions between these two, is what direction do all of these move in? These cases are all someone prohibits, someone then cannot come in and permit, right? You can't move from stringency to leniency. Do either of these texts teach us anything obvious about if Rabbi A says, yes, that's permitted, and then the person is like, for some reason asks a second question, and Rabbi B says, no, it's prohibited? Do we know anything about that case from these two Gemaras? No. Great. So this is not just about power and kind of access to knowledge in a pure way. It also seems like there is a reluctance to move in a lenient direction from a stringency, but we don't know if maybe, right, if the principle is we don't want to disrespect the previous rabbi and their ruling stands, then it shouldn't matter if we're going in the direction of leniency or stringency. But if it's like, well, once someone said it's forbidden, we always are going to go with a more strict approach, no matter what order it happened in, that's a really different take. Okay, I'm going to put you in Chavruta for a little bit. Whoa. But first, okay, so the title of this year has the word epistemic in it. I would like someone to give me a definition of epistemic. This is not a pop quiz. But before you go and talk about epistemic justice and injustice, tell me what epistemic means. Yeah?
How do you know what you know?
Great. Great. Epistemic is like the knowing of knowledge. Okay, what's hermeneutic? Yeah.
Think about interpretation, how we interpret things.
Great, yes. Interpretation and sometimes the rules for interpretation. So I'm going to have you read some very dense modern philosophy. If you've ever learned Gemara, it's like that, in that there's going to be a lot of words that you're using context to help you understand. Some words that you might know from elsewhere that don't mean something that don't mean the same thing here. And your goal here is to get what we might call a Daf Yomi read on Miranda Fricker. That is to say, what is the gist? I don't want an even reading where you could give me all the Rishonim. I want you to be able to step back and be like, I think she's kind of saying this. Okay? So don't get too bogged down. We're gonna take, I'm gonna say 7-ish minutes. It's like a little bit before 4. At 4:05, we're gonna come back, find a chavruta. Not everyone takes for granted how chavruta learning should happen. What should happen in your chavruta? One or both of you reads the text out loud. Whether or not you are an auditory processor, reading the text out loud is a key part of chavruta as a practice. You can then take a break to read it to yourself if you need. You then discuss what you think the text is saying on a lowercase m meaning level, where you want to kind of get agreement between you and your chavruta. Right? You want to feel like, oh, I think Fricker is arguing that the sky is blue, and if your chavruta says, oh, I think Fricker is arguing that the sky is pink, that's a problem. You want to make sure that you feel like you have a shared understanding of the text's claims. Then you go up to capital M meaning making, where you might say, you both agree that Fricker says the sky is blue, but one of you thinks it's a metaphor for the fact that we should always look on the bright side, and the other one thinks that it's about her experience of colorblindness and how she got magically cured. Right? That's meaning making where you can disagree. Make sense? Okay. You should focus on the first lowercase m kind of meaning making, because I'm giving you about 5 minutes to do this, and we're gonna come back and do some of the uppercase m. Any questions about your assignment? Okay, make a new friend or don't make a new friend. I'm not the boss of you. one point from each person. Any person who would like to volunteer. What's one thing you think Fricker is saying from the delightful, rich stew of continental philosophy? Yes.
That when like collective meaning making and rule making happens while excluding certain perspectives, then when those perspectives will then experience the collective rule making as like, you know, in conflict with their identity or their perspective.
Great.
Because they weren't a part of that initial kind of.
Great. Excellent. Yes. Great. What else is Fricker saying? Yeah.
I think she's trying to reground the the basic insights of the stance that they call standpoint epistemology, or people who don't like it call it that. Right. The idea that because you are a certain identity, you have a certain knowledge that other people who don't have that identity don't have. But to reground it in something that isn't based on an essentialized concept of identity.
Lovely. Yes. It's about who's been given access to the tools for knowing, rather than the knowledge coming from some like inherent identity-based well.
Yep.
Great. What else? What else felt important in Fricker? Yeah.
That access to knowledge and the gatekeeping access to knowledge is self-perpetuating and strengthens itself over time as people continue to be excluded from the process of developing.
Excellent. Because it's not just about knowledge qua facts, right? It's about knowledge as a set of skills or tools. Yeah, listen.
There's this bit where that my professor pointed out to me where many like communications made by people who are in the marginalized group, they're not seen as rational.
Right.
They're not taken as valid.
Great. And in part that's because they're not using the right tools, because they haven't been given the right tools, but then because they can't play the game on the terms of the people making the rules, their opinions are discounted or not taken seriously. Yeah.
This isn't like a direct thing that she said, but it's kind of how she said it. I think that there's gotta be something ironic or tongue-in-cheek about how she's discussing how you have to use the language of the elite to get through to the elitists. And she's doing it in a way that we all are sitting here and like really trying to parse through, and it is just not in plain English at all.
Great. I think that is a broader question of how people in the discipline of academic philosophy see themselves that I'm not qualified to answer. See me later for my opinions on that. Yeah.
I think there's, maybe this was partially said already, but it's not just that people, marginalized groups are less able to communicate, but she's making the claim that they're less able to understand themselves.
Great. They're less able to understand what's going on, what's happening to them in their own lives, because they don't have the kind of language, right? Like, you might, like on a really easy level, like, imagine that I experienced sexism as a woman rabbi, but I didn't know the word sexism or the concept. That would make my life a lot harder, right? As distinct from the fact of the sexism. Okay, what do you think this has to do with halacha? I can't think of it. It's leading, I've led you there. This is not a trick question, yes?
I don't know, I always think about just like, I know a lot of various like underlying Halachic principles, but I don't know how to get to the answer most of the time from there. And I always have to ask various rabbis or people who have a lot more training in how to navigate the flow of thought.
Great, if you're trying to get to an answer, you might know components but not the whole process such that you can get to an answer that feels like it has integrity within the system such that you know the system exists and you know the system has rules, but you don't know all the rules and how they fit together. And so you have to go to someone who does have that knowledge. Yeah.
The irony is I'm not sure quite how to say this, but I think there's something to the effect of if you have a Halakhic question, if I have a Halakhic question that is important to me and that I need to be answered about a very delicate subject in my life, if I don't know a lot about that subject matter, I'm not going to know necessarily which rabbis will give me which kinds of answers that may have radically different impacts on and if we're taking the Gemara and what is our including seriously, then that has major implications for not knowing what answer you're going to get.
Right, so not only do you not necessarily have all the tools to get to the answer yourself, you are not well versed enough to know which specialist thinks which way about the thing and would prioritize the same things you might want to prioritize to ask them. Right, the levels of inside baseball are they're very layered, exactly. Yes?
To reinforce that, also the two Gemaras you brought, the rabbis are giving one-word answers, and to know this information also
Great. So I'm not sure the Gemara is imagining the rabbis giving one-word answers as much as it's summarizing a scenario. It could be, we could read really generously and say they go to Posek A and Posek A says, okay, well I looked at the Ramban and the Tosfot and Rambam, and then the Shulchan Aruch is like this, and then the Mishnah. This is obviously all an anachronism because they were Amoraim. I don't know, depending on your theology. It's possible, but you're right that here it's very binary, right? This is not a case where someone comes from Psak and gets what we might call not Psak, where the rabbi says, okay, well I think you could do this or that, and the factors that would make you lean towards doing this are these, and the factors that would make you lean towards doing this are these, and now you have all the information, go ahead. Right? That's not Psak. And it is often preferred by rabbis in my milieu, often myself included. But that kind of avoid, and that kind of thing is why I was interested in this topic, is because is that ethically better, or is that avoiding the actual power I have in the situation? Right? Am I giving the person access to the tools they need, or am I evading my responsibility because I'm actually giving them access only to the tools that I think that they need? Okay. This question is at least as old as the Gemara. Okay, what you need to know to understand this Gemara is this character Yalta is a very important woman. She's married to the sage Rabbi Nachman. What you also need to know is that the rabbis had an entire system of menstrual blood that was pure and impure based on colors. Primarily in Nida practice today, colors become a much smaller part of the rulings about what's pure and impure / makes a person need to go to the mikvah or not. But judgment of fine distinctions between blood colors was very, very common, and it was very, the Gemara would like us to believe it was very, very common and was a kind of key way that the ancient rabbis saw themselves as getting involved in Nida questions. And this was kind of proprietary knowledge in that it was not taught to everybody. And who among the everybody do you think it wasn't taught to? Right. Women and or anybody who menstruated, which at the time they seemed to think were the same thing. Okay, we're gonna read this Gemara, we're gonna go around, and I'm gonna ask everyone to read a paragraph. Again, I have edited the Sefaria Koran translation because it gave us way too much, and I wanted to give us, I wanted to feel at least a little bit more like the original Gemara. But again, bold is a direct translation, not bold is an interpolation to make it make more sense. And we're just gonna popcorn it. I would like read one chunk and then pause, and then I will interrupt because I have things to say. Yeah, Jonathan.
Yalta brought blood before Rabbi Bar Hana, and he deemed her ritually impure. She then brought it before Rav Yitzchak, son of Rav Yehuda, and he deemed her pure.
Okay, so that seems like a problem. If you're enough in the Halakhic world, you think that the problem is that she's asking the same shaila to two poskim. If you're a little bit less in the Halakhic world, and perhaps attuned to what is kind of normal, the problem might be, why is this lady showing her menstrual blood to a bunch of rabbis? And I actually don't want us to lose track of that. That the body, gender, power piece here is really alive. This is actually, I think, importantly distinct as a case from I was eating yogurt and then I put the spoon in my chicken soup pot.
Is the other also obvious thing of just this is confusing, what should she do? Is that also a problem here, or is that
Can you spell it question a little more?
It's just as in she asked one and it was ritually pure and the other ritually impure. That what does she do then? I just the very topless question of just so
Seems usually in the Gemara, if there's two opinions and then it doesn't discuss them more, not always, but generally as a principle, we assume the second one wins.
Okay.
Not universal. Don't don't poskin based on any of this, but certainly not based on what I just said. Okay. But how could he act in this manner? Right? The Gemara has a Gemara-y problem and not our problem about gender. But isn't it taught in a Braita? Who's going to read this? Yeah.
But isn't it taught in a Braita? In the case of a Halakhic authority who deemed an item impure, another is not allowed to deem it pure. If one Halakhic authority deemed a matter prohibited, another Halakhic authority is not allowed to deem it permitted.
Great. So the problem here, who's the problem about? The rabbi. Great. How could he act in this manner? How could Rav Yitzchak be willing to paskin Yalta's Mida question, which he's already got an answer? Okay, so now we're going to solve this. Okay, this is actually not a problem, you guys. Don't worry, nobody's broken any rules. Okay, who's going to get this next bit? Yeah.
Initially, he deemed her impure, but he changed his mind when she said to him, "Every day I bring blood of this kind of this color to Rabbi Bar Khan, and he deems me pure." And specifically now he issued a different ruling as he feels clean in his eyes. He then deems her pure.
Okay, great. So someone tell me in your own words, what's the reason why Rav Yitzchak thinks it's okay that he paskins Lakula, that he says she is pure? Yeah.
He has new information.
Great, and what's the new information?
That she does this a lot.
Great, what's the other new information? There's a lot of new information here. What's the other important piece of new information?
The first cossack was having eye problems.
Great, the first guy was having eye problems. She's like, I bring blood this color all the time to the first guy, and he always says it's pure. And it's just this time, he had pink eye or something, and it was messing up his sense of sight. And then, once Rav Yitzchak heard that, he was like, oh, okay. This is an extenuating circumstance. I'm not actually paskining against my colleague, Rabbi Barakah. Okay, does that kind of make sense from here? On a, comprehension level. Okay. We could just put a nice big check next to that and move right along. That's not what we're doing. So, the Gemara's got a question. Someone tell me what the Gemara's question is by reading it.
Yeah. But are people deemed credible in cases like this? Yes, and likewise, it is taught in America. A woman is deemed credible if she says, I saw blood like this color, but I lost it.
Okay, so our question is, do we believe Yalta just told Rav Yitzchak a story, right? Yalta was like, oh, normally I bring it to Rabbi Baruchana, and he always says it's fine, but this time he has an eye infection. And the question is, do we actually rely on her? There's a number of angles of do we actually rely on her, right? One of them is a woman giving reliable testimony? Another is, when a person is telling us something about their life that is halakhically relevant, where they might be, where one answer is clearly better for them than another, do we trust them generally? So there's a gender piece, but there's also if you were you asked me a shaila, and I was like, well, how hot was the water in the sink? Because if it was hot enough to burn you, I would say it's probably more of a problem than if it wasn't. And then you say, it was kind of hot enough to burn me, I think. Not that the person is lying, but that those kinds of leading questions might make a person a little bit less reliable about facts. Okay. However, yes, we do. We believe people in cases like this, because so too, if a person is like, I saw menstrual blood come out of me that looked like this same color that I'm pointing to now on some other different, probably a different appearance of the same blood, of the same color, but I lost it, so I can't bring you the sample to evaluate, Rabbi. We do believe them. We will generally believe people's testimony about specifically the physical facts of their need of blood. Okay, but then we've got another problem. I thought we knocked this problem down and we're good now, but this whole story is still standing. We've got kind of sidebar quest here. Okay, I'm just gonna read this. I will start cold calling people. Yeah.
A dilemma was raised before the sages. If a woman states, my blood, which has an appearance like this, so-and-so, the Halakhic authority deemed it pure, what is the halacha?
Great, so the woman shows up, she's like, Rabbi Ploni already told me that this was fine last time, and I'm like, okay, but I don't know you, where you come from. Do we trust them do we trust them not only about their blood, but about the ruling they were given about their blood, right? That adds another level. Right? Not only the question is the person not only credible about the things coming out of their own body, but are they credible to repeat accurately what they've been told by another rabbi? Commentary resolution. We're going to solve this question. How do you solve it? Yeah.
Come and hear a resolution to this dilemma from the Baraita cited above. A woman is deemed credible if she says, I saw blood like this color, but I lost it. There is different, as indicates that the blood, the blood is not for her, and therefore the same is relieved.
So that case is actually not totally analogous, because if you're looking at something that's an actual color, if you're looking at the actual blood itself, that's one thing. But if you're saying, oh, I lost it, then we can maybe be lenient. And in general, there's a halachic principle that when we're talking about blood stains in the category of nida, and there's a case of doubt, we're always a little bit more lenient. Right? If there's a case of doubt and your options are to be stringent or lenient, in a case of doubt with nida blood stains specifically, we're lenient. But the absence of physical evidence matters here. Okay, we're not going to spend too much time on that. We're going to move right along to, we're going back to our story. Yalta's back. Or we're talking about Yalta at least. She's not back. Yeah. What? Yes, you did.
Come in here, the incident cited above, as Yalta brought blood before Rabbi Bar Chana, and he deemed her ritually impure. She then brought it before Rabbi Yitzchak, son of Rabbi Yehuda, and he deemed her pure. And the Gemara asked, how could Rabbi Yitzchak, son of Rabbi Yehuda, act in this manner? Isn't it taught in a Baraita? In the case of a halachic authority who deemed an item impure, another halachic authority is not allowed to deem it pure?
So back to our original question, right? Okay, we've kind of come in a circle a little bit. We've resolved a lot of inconsistencies along the way. We've got a different answer here. Right, so if the blood is not before her, we're like maybe a little more doubtful. But then we've come back to like, how is Rabbi Yitzchak doing this? Our answer is Rabbi Yitzchak relied on his studies. I.e., Rabbi Yitzchak was making his decision seemingly based on knowledge that he had, and he was not basing his decision on anything that Yalta was telling him. Right? It seems like he is basing his decision on things he knows from looking at blood, rather than things he knows because Yalta is telling him. Because this is a different case than if someone came and said, I had a blood stain that looked like XYZ. Because there, you're relying on the person's testimony about XYZ. Here, the only thing to rely on is Yalta saying, Rabbi Bar Chana had an eye issue, which is very different than Yalta saying, Yalta's testimony is not directly about the evidence. What's the story about? What's the point? That is a bad facile question, and I'm asking it anyway. Yeah.
Can I ask a comprehension question?
Yes.
Is this last thing that you rely on the studies, is this assuming that she had told him about the pain in the eye, or is this a different?
This is the Rishonim read it as assuming yes. They believe, like he relied on his studies. Rashi reads this as saying what that means is it's not that he's listening to Yalta's testimony that Rabbi Bar Chana would have said it was pure. It was that he, looking at it independently, would have thought it was pure. But he was worried because Rabbi Bar Chana had said it was impure, and he wouldn't want to rule against his colleague. But now that he has this other fact about his eye infection, he can.
So the ending is a combination of those two?
Yes. Yes.
You can imagine a thought bubble and Rabbi Yitzchak's mind asking, how do I convince people to take this whole halacha thing seriously, right?
Yeah.
Okay, he has the facts of his case in his own mind, and he has an opinion, and he has Yalta's statement. So, is she able to say something that is sufficiently credible that other people will take at face value to say he's not just undermining another chacham?
Right, excellent.
But the integrity of the entire system is still taken seriously.
Great. I'm going to use that to ask another question. Okay. I'm going to ask you a yes or no question, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands in response to yes and a show of hands in response to no. You have to pick one. If I see any of this, I'm throwing you out of the room. This is a thought exercise. You do not have to stick with it.
It doesn't sound like epistemic justice.
I'm modeling epistemic injustice. But I'm giving you the tools to understand. Option A is, this story shores up faith in rabbinic authority and the rabbinic system. It is strengthening the force of the Halakhic rabbinic system and rabbinic authority. Option B is, this story is tearing it down. Tearing it down, making it the strongest possible formulation. We might say, if that's too strong for you, we might say, this story is poking some holes, raising questions about rabbinic authority and the authority of the Halakhic system. Okay, option A, this story is supporting rabbinic authority. This is making the rabbis seem powerful, dominant. Okay. Okay. This story is challenging in some way the integrity authority of the Halakhic system. Okay, this is a beautiful, beautiful spread. Okay, I want to hear from Team A. If you were immediately like, this is a story about upholding halacha, upholding the system, upholding the power structures, upholding the authority. Yeah.
I would say it is upholding because they're using another rabbi to find another perspective as opposed to using her own experience.
Excellent. Okay. So, like, Yalta's experience is ultimately disregarded in some way. Like, they trust her testimony that the other rabbi had an eye infection, but by the end of the story, that's the only bit of Yalta's kind of voice that's affecting themselves. Yeah.
The fact that this comes as a gada shows that the rabbis are seeing it as a potential challenge to their authority and are thus discrediting it in their own retelling by putting it in the mouth of a woman, first of all, which to the rabbis very much is going to discredit it, and additionally turning the conversation back to focus on how rabbinic thought works and how determining Halakhic decisions works, rather than focusing on the reality that they have just totally given as assumed that a woman needs to come to a rabbi with these questions, which has no question at all.
Somebody either assigned you Christina Hayes or taught you about Christina Hayes' idea without citing them, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
And I'd say that the story is at its core about the dignity of Rabbi Bar Chana, that it's about, the dignity of a sage who has made evidently an error, right, an obvious error. And I'm not even sure that we could say that Rabbi Yitzchak is relying on Yalta's testimony. He's relying on the fact that he can see that Rabbi Bar Chana has made an error.
Right. By the end of the Gemara, that's where we are.
What?
By the end of the Gemara, that's where it's clear that that's where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not,
the Gemara takes us there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay, if you were on Team B, you were like, this story is about undermining or challenging the complete picture of rabbinic authority the Gemara wants us to believe. Why do you say that? Yeah.
We have two Baraita quoted in this, and both of them are just thrown out by the end. And those are more authoritative sources. Like the Gemara would have just shut it down and been like, we should have stuck by Rabbi Bar Chana if we wanted to follow by halacha.
Interesting. So we're giving reasons why it was okay to do something different.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like the system undermining the system in that sense, in your reading.
It seems like a conscious choice to not, it lays out the system, and then it says, here's this other way that we chose to go with it that's now part of the system, but wasn't part of the system beforehand.
So it's kind of like integrating, in some ways it's like naturalizing objections to the system within the system.
Yes.
So you two actually aren't saying something so different, you're just reading it differently in terms of what the kind of how we ought to conclude about that. Yeah, sure.
I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but I think that it is kind of demonstrating kind of a fallback measure, where instead of saying I have the authority based on the halakhic world they're in to make a further decision, it's just saying I'm going to just fall back to vertical precedent here instead of taking this case as unique. And the act is saying oh, there is vertical precedent above me. So I'm not going to make a decision here. I'm just going to kind of fall back on the situation at hand. Is in some ways a weakening of Halakhic authority in that it's saying this rabbi cannot be an authority. In this unique case, he has to defer to a case that is different than his unique case, and doing so might be in protection of the man whose feelings he cares about, rather than perhaps the woman in front of him whose feelings he doesn't care about as much. But it demonstrates a bit of a weakness of the strength of the Halakhic system to defer to the feelings of this rabbi.
So that the kind of like cool logic thing isn't winning because of our kavod for Rabbi Bar Hana, and we have to do a whole song and dance to get to a point where it's okay to override Rabbi Bar Hana.
Yeah. Which might make the Halakhic decisors more powerful, but it doesn't make the Halakhic system more powerful.
Right. That is like ultimately the system, the people in the system and the system are kind of distinct, and we're maybe honoring one at the cost of believing that the kind of like pure logic world of halachas is should such a thing exist.
It's like it's the protecting of somebody's name over the following the laws and the rights as they're written.
As a kind of, okay, great. So something I want to pull our attention to is that especially in Shira's answer, but to some degree in all of these answers, there were different assumptions about whether or not there is objective halachic truth. Right? You're like, there's an objective halachic truth, and they're overriding it out of, which is that Yalta's blood is pure, and they're overriding it out of preference for the honor of Rabbi Bar Hana. What's another option? Option A, there's objective halachic truth, and a post can be right or wrong. Yeah.
Halachic truth only exists if you believe in rabbinic authority in the first place, and so if you discredit it, then there is no halachic truth, and thus no need to discredit it.
Okay, but even more so.
And even more so, like rabbinic authority is determined by all of this like power plays and respecting people's names and not like throwing out someone's opinion and wanting to like find a way to make it right. Because if you undermine your colleague, then your colleague has no more power, and thus the whole system has lost power.
Great. We can also say that, like, the validity of halacha depends on what halacha does, or what poskim do. There's a fascinating ravid that basically all of the other Rishonim freak out about and try to limit. But the Ravad, who is a Tosafist, that's what you need to know, says that the reason that the second rabbi cannot rule the item pure is because it has become a chatichat isor, which is to say it becomes like a piece of isor. That's not a good translation, you guys. Like, it becomes a prohibited item fundamentally. Which is to say that, like, when Rabbi A says this piece of meat is treif, the piece of meat actually takes on a treif status. It is not that Rabbi A is describing it and Rabbi B could be like, no, your description was incorrect. It's that it has actually been, the object itself has taken on metaphysically a status, which is distinct from the like halacha is describing and can describe less accurately or more accurately, right? We might say, so on that reading, right, maybe the problem isn't about the accuracy of, isn't like, oh, is Rabbi Bar Hana describing it right? It's maybe whether or not he like originally was like wrong and somebody else would have said it is pure. Once he has said it is impure, there might be kind of, he's created facts. It's impure. Like ontologically, you cannot go back and make it pure because it is now a different thing. And then all the Rishonim are kind of like, so your role, like this sugya obviously poses a problem for that theory of what psak is, in that it does get undone, and so they have to say, oh, well, if it was a mistake about the realia, or if it was a mistake about, like, if it was like clearly a mistake about the inherited traditions, then like, we can kind of soften that. But fundamentally, I think that's those are two kinds of approaches to psak, among many. Right? There's a sense of like, how many of you have ever asked for psak about something, and then, you know, and I'm gonna pick on you a little bit, and like felt like, okay, great, it's out of my hands now. Great. That's like the relief piece, right? And I've said this to people. I've been like, if you're having faith, that's on me now. I'll deal with it when I get to Shemayim. Right? There's a sense of like, you've kind of handed over all the power and authority. The facts are the facts. And it's not like a person can like, go get a second opinion because the reality is the reality. It's like, once I tell you your oven is kosher, your oven is kosher to you, is one way of believing that psak works. As opposed to saying like, which is also a kind of more mystified version of what rabbis are, right? That's the like, in certain ways, that is actually, that approach to psak, which is a kind of a pretty firm approach to psak, is the exact same as, oh, kosher means blessed by a rabbi, right? It's the like, the authority figure has the, like, changes something about the item itself. As opposed to like, okay, well, like, Ashkenazim generally would do X, Sephardim would do Y. You're in a case that I would see as kind of b'diavad. So if you want to be machmir, I would follow the Ashkenazi position, so you're Ashkenazi, but like you would have grounds to rely on the Sephardi position, like, have a nice day. You're like, what do I do? And for some people, that's exactly what you want. Two. You think two. You were immediately two.
100%.
100%.
Sorry, which is one and which is two?
What a good question. One is Sock creates ontological reality, and two is Sock is about expertise, and the right way is to give over as much of that expertise as possible. Is that like, the only special thing that I have as a rabbi is that I spent a bunch of time in yeshiva. Anybody could do that. The smicha cloth isn't magic. Yeah.
As someone who offers that kind of advice a lot, you can watch the overwhelm just descend on this poor person who has often just come to receive a clear yes or no answer in a way that is based in a sociological reality where the rabbis, the people are looking for some clear answer, but often a specific one, and just the idea of needing to piece together one's own Halakhic answers in the absence of any kind of like traditional frame of how to weigh Ashkenazi or Sephardi is just totally anxiety inducing.
Right. And I think a lot of that has to do with epistemic injustice, right? No matter how much information I give people, if people don't have the tools to make the decisions with the information that I'm giving them, it will always be easier for me to say, no, the pot's just treif. Pot's not usually treif. It's very hard to treat a pot. I mean, don't try. And the question then becomes also like, how much can any individual poseket alleviate epistemic injustice? This comes up a lot. The reason I was interested in this topic initially is that I answer a lot of people's Nida questions. And a lot of ways to end up in a more lenient place on Nida is to tell people to ignore evidence of their bodies, right? Oh, you're having a lot of like blood spotting in your underwear that may make it hard for you to formally exit a Nida status? Wear black underwear. That's the like accepted sock. Your job is to know less about yourself, so you can be tahor. And that's pretty messed up. And so in some cases, right, the less knowledge a person has, the better off they are halakhically in terms of getting to a lenient place, or a place of permissiveness, or a place of, I don't want to say lenient or permissive, like a place of heter, a place of things are allowed. And that comes at a cost. And so my question is it ever ethical to give psak? Like, is the only truly ethical option, for everyone to go to yeshiva? Like, is that the only ethical way? I mean, like, I'm pro that generally anyway, but like, so with that question in mind, we're gonna read one more source. There is a beautiful machloket between Rachel Adler and Charlotte von Robert on what is going on with this Yalta story. I didn't bring you the von Robert because I didn't have enough time, and I decided to give Adler the final word out of kavod. But if you're interested, I'll send you the article. So this is Rachel Adler, important Jewish feminist theologian, reading What is Yalta doing here? Because I imagine this room is a very nice mix of people who are usually psak askers and usually psak offerers. People who you might relate to as usually psak offerers are also usually regular psak askers. Like I had a whole tofu on Pesach thing that I was like, someone who's not me needs to. Which is also we get to the like reliability of the data you're getting and if you can trust someone who's got a stake in the game. But I would like someone to read out loud. Rachel Adler, what's going on with Yalta? It goes on to the next page, by the way. There's one paragraph on the next page. Yeah.
There are two ways of reading the narrative, one of which is considerably less destabilizing than the other. One could argue that Yalta is merely asking for accurate assessment of evidence and consistency of judgment.
Great. She's like, this just doesn't seem like this is just kind of factually wrong, and I would like the facts to be correct. Or,
but a darker, more ironic read results if we assume that Yalta's account of Rabbi Bar Hana's judicial record and indisposition are calculated attempts to manipulate the system, and that her motivation for turning to a second judge is not an intellectual distaste for legal inconsistency, but is due to desire to avoid the stigma of impurity. That is the reading we would do if we regarded the story as a folktale of justice, and if we viewed Yalta as the trickster in the tale, the folkloric prankster, who incarnates and unmasks what is arbitrary, chaotic, or unjust in our universe. As a distinctively rabbinic trickster, Yalta is a kind of legal gorilla. She exposes the hidden relativity of the law and the hidden fallibility of its interpreters. The purportedly divine Torah must be translated into human authority. The Baraita seeks to protect this authority and its appearance of objectivity through a policy of judicial solidarity. But as soon as Yalta can expose dissent beneath this solidarity, she can demonstrate that the authority is not infallible. Two disagreeing authorities cannot hold copyright. If authority is divisible, it is potentially manipulable. If it is fallible, it is open to critique. If authority is human, it is vulnerable. If a judge's human pain may distort his judgment, perhaps his particular human perspective may also lose voice. The authority passing judgment on women's blood, Yalta slyly suggests, has a gleam in its eye, and that is why it mistakenly rules of blood in here.
Okay, so Yalta's messing around with the system as I was reading. Right, there's a read of this story where Yalta's so from. She's like, oh, but I got another stuff last time and I just want to double check. And then there's a read of the story where Yalta's like, are you serious right now? She's like, I know my body, I know which colors of my blood are like halakhically problematic and not. Keep in mind she's also the wife of a rabbi who in the Gemara are often the most educated women figures we see. And Yalta is like, absolutely not. I'm going to show you all that all of this is kind of made up. Not made up in the sense that there's like no halacha and halacha doesn't matter, but made up in the sense that the poskim are people, they are affected by all kinds of factors, and that Yalta can undermine the system. When I asked you earlier, do you think this figure undermines the system or shores it up? That's basically the von Robert-Adler debate. But either way, even von Robert thinks that there's Yalta's kind of poking through as a moment of rabbinic self-doubt in certain ways, per Christine Hayes' general teaching that often the rabbis will put questions about their own authority that they don't want to ask themselves in the mouths of non-Jews and women. So what does this mean? How do you ethically ask for psak? How do we incorporate what Yalta is doing here? Maybe Adler's read of what Yalta is doing here. What does it mean to have an ethical post-textual relationship? Yeah.
I think the first thing is it's actually incumbent upon the posek to understand who is coming to you, right? Is the person coming to you someone who can handle a multifaceted answer where you give some options or not?
Great. And it's also something that can be different, right? Sometimes it's the same person. If someone texts me a question about heating up food on Shabbos on Monday afternoon, I'll give them a dissertation. If it's Friday at 5, I will say yes or no. And then I'll say, follow up next week if you're interested.
I think it's also a lesson to the person asking that it's going back to the answer the person's being asked. Like, it's helpful to know why the person's asking, right? Like, if I'm like I said to him, I'll go to around it. I have this problem. I'm fine if you say no, and it's totally chill if you say no. I just like want to know what the answer is. Versus like, I have this question and I'm having a really hard time with it, and I need the either psak behind it or clerical care behind it or both for the answer that you're going to give me. Like sometimes it's that deep, sometimes it's not that deep.
Great.
And like being able to like either ask how deep is it or ascertain how deep is it, and for me to go, this time it's not that deep.
Great. Yes. Right. Sometimes a spoon is about a spoon, and sometimes a spoon is about someone's relationship with their mother whose kitchen isn't kosher. And you kind of need to know that to give responsible stuff. Which also goes to, in a sense of epistemic justice here means both. I also assume that there are concrete pieces of knowledge and frameworks that I might not have. Right? That I'm going to say, actually, I cannot make these decisions without knowledge that you have. I'm not the only bearer of knowledge and frameworks. Yeah.
I'm thinking of this essay of Foucault on power. I feel like I hate to do it, but it's important to go there. He talks about this, the power being intertwined in every single social relation. That it's like atomic building blocks of our social reality. That there are always social dynamics at play in every single conversation that we have. And that's no less true if you're giving a yes or no answer versus a nuanced toast answer. And so maybe the best that we can do in some cases is to be totally clear of what are our moral and intellectual commitments coming in, such that even if a person doesn't understand the answer that is given, they understand what are the underlying existential ways of being that are prompting you to respond to them in the way that you are, while acknowledging that the power is not going.
Yeah. And because that's a form of transparency where we might be operating with the same level of access to a hermeneutic interpretation of the world around us. Okay, so part of why I think this is important is not just how should people ask when they answer or ask Halachic questions, but I think it's similar, actually building off of what you said. Adrienne Marie Brown talks about how the communities we build are microcosms of the world we're trying to build. And something that I think really can matter in our Jewish communities is how are we relating to authority and expertise in ways that are actually healthy, and ways that are generative, and in ways that are liberatory, rather than in ways that really put the people with expertise and knowledge up on a pedestal, and they are different fundamentally from all of the other people. And how do we instead build a relationship to authority in Jewish communities around how we do halacha that is building the same kind of a relationship to authority that we want to have in the world writ large. And we want it to be as close as possible to democratic and liberatory and taking into account different experiences and knowing who knows what and who doesn't know what. And I think that halacha can be a playing field to either make those skills in ourselves worse or better. And so this is my invitation to try to do it better. All right, that's my time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for teaching. I want to say thanks to all of our teachers, to Rabbi Klapper, Rabbi Weiner, Rabbi Talit, and Rabbi Halpern. Thanks to the Cambridge Community Center for having us. There's, as you might have heard, there's a honky-tonk dance going on. It's actually being organized by someone from my synagogue, so you can check it out. And yeah, feel free to take any food. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Nina.
Yeah. I don't really know what to do with all the